The younger generation doesn't always recognize who is a true friend and who is a hidden danger. From a distance, the warning signs can seem obvious. Parents often sense trouble long before their children realize they're drifting toward it. And while a loving parent tries desperately to pull their child back, sometimes that very act of protection becomes the first step toward an unthinkable tragedy. In Hagerstown, Maryland, on a cold Halloween morning in 2008, a man left his house for work, unaware of the danger that awaited him. Just moments later, he was murdered. He was stabbed to death in the pre-dawn darkness, his body pulled across the sidewalk, his wallet stolen. The scene appeared to be a random act of violence by an unknown assailant. However, the story behind the violence was more intricate and unsettling than anyone realized. To understand how such a tragedy could unfold, we need to go back to where it all began. By the fall of 2008, Danielle Black, 15, was a high school senior, described as a smart girl with a bright future. But her academic success began to slip when she fell in with the wrong crowd. At the time, she was living with her father, Billy Lee Black, and his wife, Andrea Black, in Hagerstown, Maryland, an unassuming city of around 40,000 residents located not far from Baltimore. Danielle's childhood was never particularly easy. Her parents' relationship had been troubled for years. Billy wanted to separate and filed for divorce, which triggered a long, emotionally draining custody dispute. Thankfully, Danielle was only 2 years old then, far too young to understand the depth of what was happening. When the divorce was finalized, Danielle and her older brother remained with their father. Their mother moved on and showed little interest in the children. Billy was determined to care for his kids. He rented a small duplex for his new family, but challenges emerged immediately. Billy found it hard to balance his full-time job with the demands of raising his 2-year-old daughter and young son. He devoted all his energy to earning enough money to support them, but he worried constantly that his long hours were affecting his relationship with the children. He desperately wanted them to have a stable, loving mother figure. Those who knew Billy described him as a decent father, quiet, responsible, always trying to do the best for his family, even when life dealt him a bad hand. But stress continued to build, and the single father began drinking more heavily. Still, there were never any reports of him being violent toward the kids. Despite the instability at home, Danielle did well in elementary school and showed great promise. Her father believed she would eventually go to college and achieve the success he never had. Danielle played the trumpet, adored animals, volunteered at a local shelter, and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. As Danielle entered adolescence, family life began to crumble further. Billy's drinking turned into a dependency, yet he remained reserved and affectionate toward his children. He wasn't abusive, but alcohol was gradually consuming him, and he knew it. By 2005, he made a firm decision to turn his life around and quit drinking. To keep the family afloat, he worked even harder, taking a job in tree care, eventually starting a small business of his own. This extra income helped stabilize the household. Close friends noticed that something serious had pushed Billy towards sobriety. In 2005, overwhelmed by stress, he suffered a breakdown, even threatened to shoot himself in front of Danielle and her older brother, an incident so alarming that Billy himself recognized he needed help and drastic change. Not long after, he met a woman named Andrea. Billy was in his mid-42s. Andrea was slightly younger. Their relationship progressed quickly, and they soon moved in together. For a while, life genuinely seemed to improve. They eventually married in mid-2007. Danielle and her brother finally had a maternal presence in the home. Billy felt hopeful again. Andrea appeared kind, patient, and ready to support the family. But not everyone adjusted well. Danielle, more than anyone, resisted the new arrangement. By age 12, Danielle showed signs of depression and anxiety, attributing her emotional struggles to tension at home. Although Billy was still battling his dependence on alcohol during this period, he never abandoned his children. He sought help for Danielle, arranging months of therapy sessions, but despite his efforts, the situation continued to deteriorate. At 13, Billy first noticed fresh, self-inflicted cuts on Danielle's arms. Shortly afterward, social services placed her under supervision. She blamed her father for everything, but there was no evidence to support her accusations of improper behavior. It appeared that, as she entered adolescence, Danielle desperately craved attention. Billy found himself trapped in a vicious cycle. He had to work long hours and couldn't give his daughter the time she needed. While Danielle refused to accept her stepmother, by 14, Danielle ran away from home for the first time. After that, it became a disturbing pattern. Matters grew worse when Billy learned that his daughter had started spending time with a group of troubled youths with a notorious reputation in town. Kids loosely associated with a clique locals called the Bloods Gang. He immediately tried to intervene, afraid the influence would lead to disaster. And he was right. At 14, Danielle overdosed on prescription pills. Despite her father's warnings to stay away from these teenagers, Danielle continued, seeking any opportunity to leave the house and meet up with them. She struggled with depression and repeatedly threatened to end her life. Billy had no choice but to set strict rules to protect her from these dangerous influences. Danielle remained under social service monitoring and continued therapy with a psychologist. In February 2008, she was hospitalized again after another drug overdose. Yet another alarming incident in a growing pattern. She was discharged the next day with instructions to continue outpatient treatment. Billy remained deeply worried. His wife, Andrea, witnessed everything and shared his concern. But she felt helpless. She wanted to help the girl, but Danielle resisted any attempt at closeness, rejecting Andrea entirely and refusing to see her as a mother or even a supportive adult. As a parent, Billy grew stricter, trying to enforce discipline through tighter rules. But it only made things worse. The restrictions fueled more resentment, more conflict. Tensions in the home escalated, and Billy had no idea where all of this was ultimately heading. On Halloween morning, October 31, 2008, a neighbor left for work as usual. As he walked toward his car, he turned and froze. A man was lying on the ground. When he approached, he realized with horror that it was Billy Lee Black. He was badly injured, his face covered in blood, unresponsive. The neighbor immediately called 911. By the time police and paramedics arrived, 47-year-old Billy Black was already dead. He lay in a pool of blood, having been brutally stabbed before he even reached his vehicle. Andrea told officers that Billy always left for work around 5:30 a.m. That morning, he hadn't walked more than 10 meters before someone attacked him. When police examined the scene, they discovered Billy's wallet was missing. At first, it looked like a robbery gone wrong. But something felt off. Billy had been stabbed repeatedly in the throat and neck, one wound so deep it nearly severed his spine. Drag marks streaked across the pavement. A long smear of blood stretched several meters from the duplex's front steps. Detectives quickly realized this was far more than a simple robbery. Detectives turned their attention to the family, especially since the robbery appeared staged. But both Danielle and Andrea insisted that Billy had no enemies, no one who would want to harm him. Billy had no criminal history and had long overcome his drinking issues. Even during the worst periods of his life, he had never been violent or involved in illegal behavior. Still, one thing disturbed investigators. Danielle's behavior, everyone in town knew she was a troubled teenager, and the household had been increasingly tense in recent months. Andrea was devastated, trembling with grief and shock, but Danielle appeared calm, almost unnervingly calm, and that raised a red flag. Andrea explained that Danielle associated with a rough crowd Billy had disapproved of from the very beginning. Residents knew these teens as social outcasts who styled themselves as rebellious misfits. With this revelation, a new suspicion began to take shape. One pointing toward the victim's own daughter, detectives canvassed the neighborhood again. Initially, no one admitted seeing anything that morning. Then, new information surfaced. Around 5:30 a.m., there had been a brief commotion in the street. No one witnessed the attack directly, but a young man had been seen running away moments later. Having reviewed all available evidence, investigators turned their attention to the leader of the group, Danielle, frequently associated with Alec Scott Egger. At the time of the murder, he was 19 years old and lived just a few streets away from the Black family home. Alec was known to be close to Danielle, tall, muscular, and surrounded by dark rumors. He matched the general description of the suspicious figure seen fleeing the area that morning. Neighbors described him as someone who constantly smoked, drank, and spent time in abandoned buildings with other troubled teens who had withdrawn from society. The deeper detectives dug into his background, the more dangerous he appeared. Several neighbors even claimed Alec always carried a knife. Younger members of the group looked up to him, treating him as the one to turn to whenever they had problems. Alec's childhood had been brutal. He grew up with abusive parents, ran away repeatedly, began abusing alcohol, and banned substances at a young age. On paper, he fit the profile of a potential attacker perfectly. Detectives located him quickly and brought him in for questioning. Despite his intimidating reputation, Alec cracked almost immediately. He admitted that several weeks before the murder, Danielle had approached him and claimed her father was abusing her. The story struck a painful chord with Alec, who had himself suffered years of cruelty from his own parents. Danielle spoke persuasively, and Alec became convinced that Billy deserved to be punished. In his mind, he believed he was helping a friend escape the suffering he had once endured. Early in the morning of October 31st, Alec lay in wait in the bushes near the Black family's front walkway. Danielle had told him exactly when her father left for work and how to catch him off guard. As soon as Billy stepped out at around 5:30 a.m., Alec confronted him and accused him of abusing his daughter, physically and mentally. Billy furiously denied it. A short, heated argument followed, quickly escalating into violence. Alec claimed Billy pulled a knife first, forcing him to defend himself. According to him, he retaliated by drawing his own knife, which he admitted he always carried, stabbed Billy multiple times in the head, neck, until he collapsed, bleeding heavily. Drag marks in the driveway matched Alec's statement that he pulled the body away from the house. To stage a robbery, he took Billy's wallet, which contained cash and a credit card. In November 2008, Alec was charged with first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances. He repeated his claim that Billy had started the fight and insisted he only intended to scare him or rough him up a little. But investigators found no evidence to support this version of events. Billy was not carrying a knife, and those who knew him said he never kept such a weapon for self-defense. Detectives believed Alec was lying, hoping to shift blame or reduce his charges by portraying it as self-defense. Investigators then focused on proving Danielle's role in orchestrating the killing. Danielle denied any involvement, but evidence surfaced quickly. In December 2008, she was arrested and charged with solicitation of murder, supported by numerous witnesses who confirmed she played an active part in planning her father's death. Several students from her school came forward, revealing that Danielle had openly tried to find someone willing to kill Billy. While some of what circulated in the hallways was rumor, multiple classmates had directly overheard conversations. One of the earliest incidents occurred less than a month before the murder. Danielle approached a student named Matthew Gray on the school bus and offered him money to kill her father. After detectives assured him protection, Matthew agreed to give a formal statement. He explained that he initially assumed Danielle was joking, even asked her what she would pay. Several classmates overheard the exchange, but when he realized Danielle's tone was serious, he stopped engaging and ignored further discussion. After Billy's murder, Matthew understood she had meant every word. Many of Danielle's acquaintances confirmed hearing her talk about alleged abuse at home. Despite these claims, no formal complaints were ever filed, and no one had ever seen visible injuries on Danielle's body. Because of this, most people dismissed her stories as exaggerations or cries for attention. Andrea, Billy's wife, insisted she had never once witnessed Billy mistreating his daughter. She said he had never even raised his voice at Danielle without substantial reason. In her view, Billy was far too lenient, and Danielle was simply spoiled. At school, Danielle frequently complained about her father. Some classmates believed she lived in a toxic environment, even though they had never seen any real proof. A friend named Ashley Schmid recalled seeing a small bruise on Danielle's leg. Danielle claimed Billy had hit her, but Ashley later admitted the mark could have come from anything. Andrea described her stepdaughter as a manipulator who despised her father, while Billy himself was deeply troubled by the situation. Hoping that time would help heal their strained relationship, Billy's older son couldn't understand the hostility between his father and Danielle. He saw no real cause for it. Aside from Billy's attempts to limit Danielle's contact with the troubled teens, she spent nearly all her free time with. He never imagined the situation could escalate into violence, let alone murder. Looking back, he believes Danielle may have been suffering from unmanaged psychological trauma. Ashley Schmid later told detectives that shortly before the murder, Danielle admitted she wanted someone to attack her father. According to Ashley, Danielle detailed the plan step by step. She said Billy arrived home about 30 minutes before Andrea, and she intended for him to be assaulted the moment he walked through the door, so that Andrea would be the one to find his body. Alarmed, Ashley told her parents because they knew Danielle was troubled. They became concerned. That same evening, Ashley called Danielle's home. Billy answered the phone, sounding normal. Believing nothing had happened and assuming Danielle's threats were just a sick joke, Ashley did not inform the police. She didn't fully grasp how serious it was. At least, not until Billy was discovered dead. Another classmate, Sean Stanton, also heard Danielle speak constantly about her father. According to him, she complained nearly every day, repeating claims of abuse and often ending with the chilling remark that she wished Billy were dead. Others in Danielle's circle confirmed this pattern, saying it seemed like an obsession. Samantha Holliday had also heard Danielle say Billy beat her, but she never saw any evidence, so she dismissed the claims as dramatization. Following Danielle's arrest, her case was initially slated to be handled in juvenile court. Prosecutors, however, petitioned to have her tried as an adult due to the severity of the charges, which could have resulted in a life sentence. Danielle was denied bail and remained in custody. While awaiting trial, sometime after the arrest, Andrea made a disturbing discovery in Danielle's bedroom. Hidden among her belongings were diary entries dating back years. Approximately 20 poems filled with dark, violent imagery. Several hinted at banned substances, Many were explicitly directed at her father, expressing hatred and fantasies of harm. The diary painted a chilling picture of a deeply troubled teenager with alarming thoughts, but in the diary, Danielle repeatedly wrote that her father deserved to die. Despite this, Andrea reiterated that no violence had ever occurred in the home Danielle later claimed these writings reflected her emotional struggles and her anger over Billy's restrictions on her friendships with troubled teens. Even more unsettling were entries addressed to another, unnamed target. Andrea believed she might have been the next person on Danielle's list. One entry described using witchcraft to hurt her. Danielle claimed she was a witch and threatened to curse Andrea. The final entry stated that Danielle wasn't afraid of going to prison. Prosecutors planned to introduce these writings at trial as evidence of Danielle's motive and mental state. Danielle underwent a full psychiatric evaluation and was diagnosed with adjustment disorder. She was prescribed clinical therapy sessions, which she completed successfully. The treatment focused on helping her develop coping strategies for the anxiety and depressive symptoms she struggled with, as well as guiding her through the emotional impact of losing her father. The court ultimately granted the prosecution's request to have Danielle tried as an adult. Her defense team petitioned to move the case back to juvenile court, but the judge denied the request shortly before the hearing, citing the gravity of the offense. Danielle was formally charged as an adult. During the hearing, her attorney argued that Danielle had long suffered from multiple undiagnosed mental health issues that had been overlooked for years by both professionals and family. The defense claimed that Danielle's fragile psychological state, combined with the negative influence of her peer group, had fueled the violent thoughts and behavior that led to the crime. Danielle Black went to trial for solicitation of murder in July 2009. Several prosecution witnesses testified, describing conversations they overheard about the plot and recounting how Danielle had even offered money to other teenagers to kill her father. Despite this, the defense argued that there was insufficient evidence to prove she intended the crime to happen. Her stepmother, Andrea Black, also took the stand. She firmly denied that Danielle had ever been abused. Andrea said Danielle's anger came from being spoiled, not harmed. She testified that during the many years she lived with Billy, she never once saw him behave violently or even disrespectfully toward his daughter. Andrea confirmed that Billy had forbidden Danielle from spending time with certain troubled teenagers shortly before his death, and she believed this rule may have triggered Danielle's hostility. According to Andrea, Billy regretted having to limit her freedom, but he genuinely believed he was protecting her. After both sides rested, the jury deliberated for around 90 minutes before returning a verdict: guilty of solicitation to commit murder. Because Danielle Black was only 16, her sentence was capped at 10 years in prison. At the sentencing hearing, Danielle finally broke down. She admitted that she had lied about the abuse and that none of her claims against her father had been true. She confessed she had been angry because Billy refused to let her do everything she wanted. Tragically, the night before Billy was murdered, he had hugged her and told her he loved her, that he was trying to protect her from bad influences. Meanwhile, Alec Scott-Egger, the young man who carried out the attack, underwent psychiatric evaluation at the request of his attorneys. They argued that Alec had shown symptoms of psychosis, severe depression, and other mental illnesses since the day of his arrest. This request delayed his trial and raised the possibility of a diminished capacity defense. Alec initially pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity in January 2010. However, Alec, 20-year-old, accepted a plea deal. He admitted to killing Billy, but insisted he had not planned to kill him, only to intimidate or beat him. According to Alec, the situation escalated suddenly. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Before being led away, he addressed Andrea, expressing remorse for Billy's death and blaming Danielle's accusations for fueling his actions. He said that if he could change anything, he would. In 2011, the Maryland Court of Appeals overturned Danielle's conviction, ruling that her testimony may have been unfairly influenced and that the trial judge erred by allowing the prosecution to introduce evidence Unrelated to Alex's incitement, Danielle received credit for the time she had already served. Just over 3 years after entering prison, Danielle Black was released, placed on 5 years of probation, and required to report regularly to authorities under strict supervision. In 2015, Alex Scott Egger's attorney filed an appeal in an effort to challenge the court's decision. However, the request was denied. To this day, Alec remains in prison, continuing to explore every legal option available in hopes of securing his release. In Luton, Bedfordshire, United Kingdom, on the evening of Monday, May 23, 2016, a 34-year-old woman was brutally murdered inside her family home on Overstone Road. Saima Khan, a devoted mother of 4 young children, became the victim of a crime so savage that it shocked the entire community. She had been stabbed 68 times. The wounds were so vicious that her head and arm were nearly severed. From the outside, the Khan residence looked like an ordinary, modern family home, blending in with the other houses in the quiet, suburban street. But inside, officers encountered a scene of horrific carnage. Blood was everywhere, as if gallons had been splattered across the walls, stairs, and floor. This story centers on the Khan family, originally from Pakistan. Saima, the elder, was born in 1982, while her younger sister, Sabah, was born 7 years later, in 1989. The family also included 2 brothers. They spent their early years in the Netherlands, but when Saima turned 18, the entire family relocated to England in search of better opportunities. The Khan household was traditional, yet modern. They maintained strong Islamic values and pride in their heritage, while also adapting to Western life. Both sisters grew up fluent in Dutch and later mastered English after the move. They shared a deep bond. Saima, known for her kindness and gentle nature, often looked after Sabah like a second mother. Sabah adored her older sister, once saying they were one soul divided between 2 bodies. When the family settled in Luton's Overstone Road, they joined a large Pakistani community. Luton, about 30 miles north of London, has one of the largest Muslim populations in the UK, with nearly a third of residents identifying as Muslim. Here, Saima pursued her dream of helping others by studying nursing. She had a natural gift for caregiving and wanted to dedicate her life to supporting those in need. After completing her training, she began working as a home care nurse. Patient described her as reliable, warm, and compassionate, a woman who radiated calm. The Khan family lived in a 2-story brick townhouse, typical of many European neighborhoods. Each apartment in this townhouse had a separate street-level entry. Such homes are commonly found in most European cities. By the time Saima turned 21, her parents began searching for a suitable husband for her. In keeping with tradition, they reached out to extended relatives in Pakistan. Arranged marriages are common among Pakistani families in the UK, sometimes even used as a means to secure British residency or citizenship. Many of these unions end unhappily, with young women, accustomed to Western freedoms, finding themselves in restrictive or even abusive marriages. But Saima's case was different. No one pressured her. She trusted her parents' judgment and agreed willingly. Family meant everything to her. She wanted to marry and start her own. Her future husband was Hafiz Rahman, a man 3 years older than her and 10 years older than Sabah. Hafiz had lived his entire life in Pakistan and was considered by relatives to be a respectable match for Saima. Hafiz's family hoped that moving to Britain would give him more opportunities and a better life. By marrying a British resident, Hafiz would be able to secure a British passport and become a full-fledged citizen of the United Kingdom. After the wedding in Pakistan, Hafiz and Saima returned together to the United Kingdom. The newlyweds moved into the Khan family home, following the cultural custom in many Muslim households of living as one large, close-knit family. Hafiz eventually gained citizenship and found work as a taxi driver. He held firmly to traditional values, expecting his wife to bear children, raise them, care for her husband, prepare meals, and manage the household. Saima, however, never intended to give up her career entirely. She balanced her duties as a wife with her work caring for patients. Not long after their marriage, she became pregnant with their first child, a daughter. Before she could fully recover from that pregnancy, more followed in quick succession. In the end, they had 4 children, 2 daughters and 2 sons. 3 generations of the family lived together under one roof, supporting and caring for each other. In total, 11 people shared the townhouse. Hafiz, Saima, and their 4 children, Saima's parents, her 2 brothers, and her younger sister, Sabah. On the surface, life seemed to be going well, apart from the ordinary domestic disagreements that occur in any household, especially one so large. At some point, however, Sabah began to feel growing tension with her sister. The shift started after Saima's marriage to Hafiz. Once she became a wife and mother, Saima's priorities naturally changed. To Sabah, it felt like her sister no longer made time for her, focusing instead on her husband and children. Over time, Sabah grew weary of living in her older sister's shadow. Within this crowded household, a secret began to take shape. Known only to 2 people, Sabah had fallen in love with her sister's husband, Hafiz. Shockingly, he reciprocated, despite the 10-year age gap, despite the taboo of Sabah being his wife's younger sister, and despite the fact that they all lived together under one roof. The 2 embarked on a passionate affair. Their attraction quickly consumed them both. It started innocently enough, fleeting glances, playful teasing, the rush of a forbidden thrill. Hafiz, more experienced, recognized what lay behind the young girl's looks. In truth, he exploited her immaturity and naivety. The affair began shortly after the birth of Saima's first child. Exhausted and fully absorbed in caring for her newborn daughter, Saima didn't notice the way her younger sister was looking at her husband. At the time, the sisters still had a fairly warm relationship. Sabah even helped look after the baby, playing the role of a loving aunt, while secretly melting into the arms of her sister's husband. Whenever no one was watching, the secret relationship carried on for years. It would occasionally end, only to resume with even greater intensity as time passed. Sabah became increasingly obsessed with Hafiz. They relied on WhatsApp to communicate, the only way to conceal their affair within a household filled with family members. With each passing wave of passion, the relationship grew more volatile as jealousy of her sister deepened. She was consumed with rage whenever she saw Hafiz giving Saima attention. She complained bitterly that he could message her day and night, yet could never find enough time to be alone with her. The affair was dangerously complicated. The tight-knit family, all living under one roof, turned the house into a pressure cooker, a volcano on the verge of erupting. And though the affair unfolded right under their noses, no one seemed to notice. Or perhaps they simply chose to look away, pretending nothing was wrong. Most likely, the relatives simply thought any possibility of an affair between Sabah and Hafiz was unthinkable. Their upbringing and faith didn't even allow them to imagine such a thing. Saima herself paid no attention to the strange glances between her husband and younger sister. She was a devoted mother of 4, juggling childcare with part-time caregiving work, exhausted and overburdened. She had neither the time nor the energy to keep watch over her husband, and she certainly never suspected such a betrayal from her own sister, whom she had loved, cared for since childhood. Meanwhile, Hafiz and Sabah would steal moments together whenever Saima was away. Sometimes they used the taxi Hafiz drove for work. Other times, they met in the family's marital bedroom. At that point, the children were 7, 4, 2, and 1 years old. Since Saba often stayed home to help care for them, her presence in the bedroom didn't raise suspicion. Hafiz, with the flexibility of his taxi shifts, deliberately arranged his time off to coincide with his wife's working hours. Though their affair carried on for years, Hafiz still put his wife first. This infuriated Saba. At one point, Hafiz even considered marrying Saba as a second wife. But when he consulted a local imam, he was told it was forbidden in Islam to marry 2 sisters at the same time. So Hafiz abandoned the idea and continued meeting Saba in secret. For him, she became the ultimate forbidden fruit, young, naive, and forbidden by custom from having any relationship before marriage to Hafiz. This only made the affair more intoxicating. A few months into the relationship, Saba became pregnant. Hafiz, who refused to use contraception, insisted she terminate the pregnancy to avoid scandal and keep their affair hidden. Saba went through with the abortion, but the experience left scars. It may also have been the moment Hafiz realized that continuing an affair with his wife's younger sister was unsustainable. By February 2016, after 4 years of secret meetings, Hafiz decided to end the affair and recommit to his wife and children. He began considering moving his family into their own home, away from the crowded household, but the very thought of losing him drove Saba into despair. She couldn't bear the idea that Hafiz had chosen his wife and children over her. That desperation soon twisted into something darker. Saba began obsessively searching online for ways to remove her sister from the picture. In her mind, Saima was the only obstacle between herself and Hafiz. Without Saima, Saba imagined she could step into her place, becoming his wife and raising the children as her own. Her internet searches grew more alarming. She looked up where to buy venomous snakes, studied différents poisons, researched how to hire hitmen, and even pored over an article titled 16 Steps to End Someone's Life and Not Get Caught. In March 2016, Saba reached out to a self-proclaimed sorcerer in Pakistan who claimed he could kill through black magic. Saba paid the so-called sorcerer more than $6,000 to place a deadly curse on Saima. When nothing happened, Saba grew furious. She contacts the self-proclaimed wizard again, complaining that her life is getting worse. Hafiz no longer cares about her and seems completely indifferent. She begged him to hurry and finish off her sister so that Hafiz would finally be hers. But after she sent the money for this final ritual, the sorcerer disappeared. He had been nothing more than an online scammer. Saba couldn't bear the thought of losing Hafiz forever. To her, he was her soulmate, the man for whom she had broken Islamic rules, endured an abortion, and done things most women would never dare. Worse still, her parents had started pressing the issue of marriage for her. Talks had been ongoing for months, with a potential suitor already identified, but negotiations stalled because the families couldn't agree on the terms. Even so, the pressure was immense. As much as she loved Hafiz, openly defying her parents was nearly impossible. She felt trapped, beaten down by blow after blow. To make matters worse, she had to watch her sister Saima live the life everyone envied. A devoted husband, 4 beautiful children, and what looked like the perfect marriage. By contrast, Saba was unmarried, childless, and directionless. Resentment festered, and soon her envy turned into rage. She began to blame Saima for everything that had gone wrong in her life. Those emotions drowned out any last trace of reason. For Saba, it felt like her sister was stealing the very life she deserved. To her twisted mind, The only solution was to remove Saima from the picture once and for all. Meanwhile, Saima and Hafiz had found a new apartment across Luton where they planned to move with their children. The moving date was already set, May 25th, 2016. By then, Hafiz had grown colder towards Sabah, pouring more energy into repairing his marriage. In a desperate bid to win him back, Sabah sent him anguished love messages. She wrote that no force on earth could change her feelings, that her heart was bleeding for him, and that she would do anything to prove her devotion. But behind these messages lurked a darker determination. If Hafiz wouldn't come back to her willingly, she would carve her own path to a happy ending. Sabah decided to take matters into her own hands. On May 21st, 2016, she went to a supermarket and bought a large knife. She knew that on the evening of May 23rd, her parents, brothers, and Hafiz would all be away at a funeral at the local mosque, mourning a recently deceased relative. Saima couldn't attend because she had caregiving duties that night. Sabah was left in charge of the children, a perfect setup for the plan she had been plotting. That night, once the children were asleep upstairs, the house was hers. She waited, knife ready, needing only to lure her sister home early. At 10:15 p.m., Saima left for work. Around 11, Sabah sent her a text, pretending the youngest child was inconsolable and crying for her mother. 3 minutes later, Saima replied that she was on her way back. In reality, all 4 children were sound asleep. At 11:07 p.m., a neighbor's security camera caught Saima pulling into the driveway, stepping out of her car and walking toward the front door. Seconds later, the hallway light inside flicked on. 45 seconds after that, it went dark again. Within those few minutes, Saima Khan was ambushed in her own home. The moment Saima stepped through the front door and into the ground floor hallway, she had no idea that death was waiting just a few feet away. In an instant, her younger sister Sabah lunged at her with the knife she had deliberately purchased the day before at the supermarket. Saima, caught completely off guard, lost those precious seconds that might have saved her life. She never expected her own sister to be the source of such danger, and the shock robbed her of the ability to defend herself. As the first blows landed, she struggled in vain, but the frenzied assault quickly overwhelmed her. Investigators would later confirm that Saima likely died within the first few minutes of the attack, screams that were quickly drowned out by the relentless violence of her assailant. Sabah's rage knew no limits. She stabbed and slashed with such ferocity that by the end, Saima's body bore 68 separate wounds. The injuries were so savage that Saima's throat was cut almost completely through, leaving her close to decapitation. Even after her sister collapsed, Sabah continued the onslaught, tearing off parts of her clothing and striking with such brutal force that one of Saima's arms was left hanging by little more than tissue and sinew. Upstairs, the eldest daughter was jolted awake. Frightened, she came to the top of the stairs and called out, asking her aunt what was happening. Sabah, in the middle of her gruesome act, snapped at the child, coldly ordering her back to bed and dismissing the horrific sounds as nothing more than her trying to catch a mouse. The little girl obeyed, unaware that her mother was being slaughtered just a few steps below. By then, Saima had lost massive amounts of blood. Several arteries in her jugular vein were severed. Her face, head, and arm were horribly mutilated. In the frenzy, Sabah herself suffered a small cut, though she barely noticed. When the killing was over, she quickly moved on to the next phase of her plan, staging the crime as a robbery gone wrong. She smashed a pane of glass on the back door to make it look like an intruder had forced entry. Then she stripped off her bloodied clothing, stuffed it into a plastic bag along with the knife. Saima's phone, and some jewelry and hid the items in her bedroom. Calmly, she showered, washing away the evidence of Saima's blood. Only after cleaning herself up did she call her parents and then dial emergency services. When her family rushed home, they were met with a nightmare. Saima lay in the hallway in a pool of blood, her life gone. The brutality of the scene shocked even the paramedics. The wounds were so severe that police initially believed the killer must have been a man. The first step for investigators was to question the only adult who had been in the house that night, Saima's younger sister, Sabah. She recited her version of events with a calm, almost practiced tone. She explained, that evening, everyone else had been out. Her parents, brothers, and brother-in-law Hafiz had gone to a funeral at the mosque. While Saima had gone to work, Sabah had stayed behind to watch the children. She told detectives that she had put the children to bed, though the youngest had fussed a little, prompting her to message Saima and ask her to come home sooner. By the time the baby fell asleep, Sabah said she saw Saima's car pull into the driveway. Relieved, she decided to take a shower. According to her story, moments later, she heard a loud noise and her sister's screams. Throwing on a robe, she rushed downstairs and found Saima lying bloodied in the hallway. That was when she insisted. She phoned her parents and then called emergency services. When officers asked about the cut on her hand, she claimed she had injured herself on shards of glass near the broken back door. She said she hadn't seen or heard any intruder on the surface. Her explanation seemed plausible. The smashed glass, the missing jewelry, and the horrific scene were consistent with a violent burglary. Yet, detectives couldn't ignore the details that didn't add up. Sabah's demeanor struck them as oddly detached, almost rehearsed. Given the brutality of what had just happened, her lack of visible grief or panic raised quiet suspicions. Though investigators reminded themselves that people cope with trauma in different ways, still, one fact remained clear. This was no ordinary crime. The sheer ferocity of the attack, dozens of stab wounds, the attempt to mutilate, did not resemble a panicked burglar. It looked personal. It looked like vengeance. The entire family experienced incredible grief from losing a loved one. Hafiz was beside himself. He spoke about how their shared dream of moving into a new apartment with their 4 children had been cruelly destroyed. Both he and Saima had been counting down the days to that move, looking forward to starting a happier chapter together. Now, that future had been stolen from them forever. Relatives, friends, and even police officers pleaded with the public for any information that might help track down the killer who had ripped away the life of a devoted mother. The whole community of Luton and the surrounding areas was shaken to its core. Hafiz himself gave an emotional statement, saying their family's hearts had been torn to pieces. What he didn't know at the time was that the true motive behind Saima's murder was tied to his own secret. The autopsy results painted a horrific picture. Saima had been stabbed 68 times. Forensic experts concluded that she likely died after the first few blows, but the attacker kept plunging the knife into her body again and again. Long after death, detectives were convinced this wasn't the work of a burglar. A random intruder would never waste precious time inflicting so many wounds after the victim was already gone. This was personal. This was rage. With that in mind, detectives decided to revisit the testimony of their key witness, Sabah Khan. Sabah had been close to her sister, and investigators wanted to hear her version of events again. During questioning, Sabah told them that Saima had a dark secret, a secret lover. She even suggested that this man might have been the one to ambush and murder Saima. But instead of deflecting suspicion, her story had the opposite effect. Detectives noticed how Saba seemed almost eager to smear her sister's reputation at a time when Saima could no longer defend herself. The claim didn't sit right. Family members, neighbors, and friends had all spoken about Saima's character. They were adamant she would never cheat on Hafiz. In fact, her life revolved around her children, her husband, and her part-time job. She barely had the time, let alone the energy, to pursue an affair. Still, investigators considered every angle. Could this have been an honor killing? The sheer brutality of the attack led some to believe the perpetrator was male. To narrow down suspects, police mapped out the movements of each family member in the days before the crime and seized electronic devices from the household. It didn't take long before damning evidence began to surface. Detectives discovered that Saba had recently purchased a knife at a local supermarket, the very same model used in the attack. A review of her Google searches and phone data revealed an even darker truth. Saba had been carrying on a secret affair with Hafiz for the past 4 years. Their text messages left no doubt. Saba had often written about her hatred and resentment toward her sister, even accusing Hafiz of marrying Saima only to secure a passport. Their relationship had become so volatile that Hafiz eventually blocked her on social media. The case was unraveling quickly. On May 31, 2016, just 8 days after Saima's murder, detectives conducted a thorough search of Saba's bedroom. What they found erased any remaining doubt. Hidden inside were the pieces of jewelry supposedly stolen during the staged robbery. Even more damning, they uncovered Saima's missing phone, the blood-stained knife, and clothing Saba had worn on the night of the murder. Still soaked in Saima's blood, Saba was arrested immediately. At first, she denied having any part in Saima's death. Though she admitted to the affair with Hafiz, she tried to claim that the relationship had ended after a failed pregnancy and that she had distanced herself from him. Still, she clung to the story of a robbery gone wrong. But the irrefutable evidence found in her room made this claim difficult to support. After several rounds of interrogation, Saba finally broke down. She confessed to killing Saima. In her statement, she painted herself as a victim, saying Hafiz had manipulated her for years, even abused her physically, and that she felt trapped in a relationship with a man 10 years older, more experienced, and impossible to resist. The trial took place in October 2017, and it was there that Saba Khan finally admitted the truth. She pleaded guilty to the murder of her own sister. Prosecutors laid out the chilling details of her motive. What began as an infatuation with Hafiz Rahman had grown into a dangerous, obsessive fixation. She could no longer stand the fact that Hafiz belonged to someone else. In her mind, Saima's life looked flawless. Married, with children, and a stable home, while she herself remained in the shadows. That resentment turned into rage. Hafiz, taking the witness stand, described himself as a victim of manipulation. He admitted that he had made the grave mistake of giving in to Saba's advances, but he claimed he had been trapped by her threats. According to him, Saba often said she would harm herself if he ever left her, bombarding him with messages filled with desperate declarations of love. Despite his testimony about wanting to end things, prosecutors highlighted the undeniable fact that Hafiz had still continued sleeping with Saba. Even in the days leading up to the murder, the defense tried to shift some of the blame onto Hafiz. Saba's lawyer argued that Hafiz had taken advantage of a vulnerable young woman, one who had little experience with men and suffered from mental health struggles. He painted Saba as lonely, unstable, and desperate, reminding the court that she had a history of self-harm. According to the defense, Hafiz had strung her along for years, feeding her false hope of a future together, only to retreat when things became too complicated. Saba himself showed no remorse. Not a tear, not a trace of remorse. She sat motionless in the defendant's box, her face expressionless, her eyes hollow. It was clear she wasn't mourning Saima's stolen life. She was mourning her own freedom. Sabah Khan was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. The defense immediately sought an appeal, calling the sentence excessively harsh, but the Appeals Commission disagreed. The punishment, they said, was just. And so, Sabah Khan remains behind bars in Bedfordshire, UK, where she will spend the best years of her life reflecting on the crime that destroyed her family. After the trial, Hafiz released a statement. He said he could never have imagined such horror unfolding within his own family. He admitted his deep shame for betraying his wife and confessed that not a day passes without regret. Hafiz remembered Saima as a devoted wife, a loving mother of 4 beautiful children, a daughter who made her parents proud, and a sister whose kindness touched everyone around her. He sighed. Her death left a permanent wound in the hearts of everyone who loved her. For her parents, the pain was almost unbearable. Losing one daughter is tragedy enough. But learning that another daughter was responsible, that was a nightmare no family should ever endure. And that brings us to the end of this tragic story, a story of jealousy, betrayal, and a family torn apart forever. On a quiet afternoon in January, the small town in Waller County, Texas, was suddenly shaken by a scene so horrifying that even the most seasoned police officers shuddered. In a guest house located on a large plot of land owned by a wealthy family, blood was splattered on the floor, covering the walls and ceiling. In the middle of the room, the body of a young woman lay motionless, her head severed, a bloody knife thrown next to her. It was Angie, just 21 years old, an immigrant from Nicaragua with dreams of building a bright future in America. The person standing in that room, eerily calm, was her husband, Jared Dicus, 23 years old, the only son of a prestigious family in the area. How did a love story once considered the American dream turn into a terrible tragedy? Why would a young man born into wealth, raised in a powerful family, commit such a barbaric crime? This is not just a murder, but a bloody warning about the control and violence hidden behind the facade of a seemingly perfect marriage. And to understand how things spiraled into tragedy, we have to go back to the beginning, where 2 seemingly opposite people collided. Jared Dicus was born and raised in Waller County, Texas, just over an hour's drive from Houston. His family was famous and wealthy in the area, owning a lot of real estate and land. They lived in a large house, prominent amidst the vast farms. Previously, the family had a large house and a smaller guest house, but as he grew up, the guest house was converted into his own private residence. Jared chose to live there, realizing the dream of many young Americans by not having to rent a house. He and his young wife, Angie, have lived here together. Angie was born in Nicaragua in 2001. When she grew up, she immigrated to the United States in search of a better life. Unlike Jared, her career path was initially difficult. Angie was born into a poor family. From a young age, she witnessed financial hardship. This made her hardworking and always helping her family. She is also a calm and friendly person. When she came to America, she kept a calm attitude, liked to work to support herself and help her family. Angie dreamed of building a good future. She wanted to marry an American, to settle down and receive support. With her charming appearance and sweet personality, she attracted Jared from the first meeting. At that time, she had just moved here and did not have many friends. In just a few years, Angie found a place to live and did many things at the same time. Everyone saw that she was happy with her successes. She had many big plans for the future and believed in a good life in America, but she did not expect that she was wrong. Jared and Angie's lives intersected at the end of 2022, those who know Jared all realized that he was attracted to Angie from the first meeting. He described her as an energetic and charming girl with whom he wanted to build a romantic relationship. Angie, on the other hand, had similar feelings and took the initiative to approach Jared. She saw in him the ideal future husband and father. Despite the cultural and language barriers, her English was not good. She took the initiative. Surprisingly, just a month after meeting, in October 2022, they announced their marriage. They held a small, private ceremony. At first glance, their story seemed like a dream come true for Angie. She had her own house in a small town, and it seemed that this girl from Nicaragua could build an ideal American family, have children, and develop a career. Jared had everything she needed to help her do that. Jared was the son of a wealthy family, had no money problems. He truly loved Angie. However, behind this perfect appearance, everything was not good. Before getting married, Angie regularly updated her social media profile, posting photos and various posts, but after getting married, the number of posts gradually decreased. She almost stopped taking photos with Jared after the wedding. Relatives began to ask about this change, because it was unlike the active and sociable girl like Angie, but she avoided these questions. Many people suspected that Jared had forbidden her to do those things. Angie just evaded, saying that there was no violence in their relationship, but admitted that her husband had an influence on her, making her emotionally exhausted. This did not surprise anyone. Although Jared's family was considered kind, many locals knew that he had a criminal record. He also had problems with banned substances and alcohol. His parents knew this, but they did not tell Angie because they believed that marriage would have a positive effect on their son and that he would give up his bad habits. However, the reality was quite the opposite. Soon after the wedding, Jared began to behave worse. The community knew Jared was prone to drunkenness, using banned substances, and behaving inappropriately. He was aggressive and often in trouble with the law. His first drunk driving arrest, compounded by threats to the police, brought him to their attention. Many believed he avoided jail only because of his wealthy parents. Some locals hoped Angie could help Jared change after the two got married. After the wedding, they moved into a large guest house on Jared's family land. The parents gave them the long unused guest house, hoping they would be comfortable and independent. However, this plan backfired on Angie, who became isolated instead of finding peace. Jared controlled her communication with her family, completely dominating her life with his family, rules, and habits. Angie, a resilient woman who had overcome many challenges since moving to the United States, viewed this as another obstacle. She had grown up in harsh conditions and worked hard to improve her life, initially arriving in Texas without documents, leading to constant fear of deportation to Nicaragua. Before the wedding, finding and registering for a job was difficult. Angie hoped marriage and legal status would ease her struggles, but Jared quickly exploited this vulnerability, pressuring her into submission. She feared losing everything she had worked for if she divorced him. Before meeting Jared, she had taken on numerous part-time jobs to make ends meet. After the wedding, she continued this relentless work ethic, waking before dawn to work at a local gym and then working at a fast food restaurant until late. Marriage did not bring the ease she had hoped for. She still had to work constantly. However, after the wedding, some jobs became irrelevant. She had to look for new part-time jobs, while Jared remained mostly unemployed. He found occasional work, but rarely stayed longer than a month. The small town likely contributed to his difficulties. Everyone knew of Jared's troubled past, making it hard for him to find steady employment. Some believed he was struggling to find his place, while others saw him as exploiting his parents' wealth. He could be charming when he wanted to be. However, this charm faded after marrying Angie, revealing his impulsiveness, insecurity, and anger. Angie was unaware of Jared's persistent behavioral problems until they became apparent after they were married. Within the first month, things changed. Angie began to withdraw from her friends and loved ones. Co-workers noticed her shift from cheerful to depressed, often seeing her crying in secret. She started wearing long sleeves, even in hot weather, as if hiding something. The situation was further complicated by the language barrier. Jared didn't speak Spanish, and Angie's English was limited. Eventually, her inner circle realized that Jared had become her de facto translator, her only link to the outside world, a role he manipulated for his own benefit. He began to control and dominate her. Even as his banned substance use increased, he would leave home and return late at night. Neighbors began to hear their loud arguments and screaming. In public, Angie acted as if everything was fine. She didn't share her problems, kept working hard, and avoided discussing her family life. Many people suspect she was abused both physically and mentally, but she has never confirmed it. She often showed her forearms without bruises, despite wearing long sleeves. She explained her new preference for modest clothing as a response to her husband's jealousy. He didn't want other men looking at her. In late 2022, 3 months after their marriage, those close to Angie and Jared sensed deep tension. The honeymoon ended quickly. Jared, a strong and unstable young man, became increasingly dominant and showed little concern for Angie. She struggled to talk about her problems due to a language barrier and her husband's strict control. She had no family in the U.S. to rely on. They lived on Jared's family estate, and although Jared's parents could have helped, they did not intervene. Angie's co-workers, who had known her for years, noticed she had changed. She once laughed off Jared's quirks, but later confided to a few friends that he controlled her completely. She still hoped things would improve, but they didn't. She told friends Jared often came home drunk, leading to frequent arguments. Angie began arriving at work, exhausted. She continued to deny domestic violence, yet understood she was in a vulnerable position. Her family was thousands of miles away. She had no car, little support, and her immigration status made her fearful and dependent on Jared. His parents also noticed changes in him. He grew withdrawn, irritable, and aggressive. They felt Angie pushed back against his behavior rather than trying to control him, but still did nothing. Believing the relationship would eventually make Jared more responsible, they think Angie and Jared just need time. Perhaps Jared's parents felt more at ease because Angie and Jared lived nearby, and their quarrels seemed to be nothing more than shouting. No one had seen physical violence. Angie believed Jared's behavior was driven by alcohol and banned substances, which made him paranoid and aggressive. By the end of 2022, Angie told a friend she was determined to help Jared return to normal. Loyal and supportive by nature, she didn't want to give up. But the crisis continued. In early January 2023, she posted a short video on social media. She was drinking coffee alone, listening to music, and appeared happier by herself than with her husband. The post had a brief, reflective caption. Tragically, she had only days left to live. The morning of January 11, 2023, began like any other. For months, she had followed the same routine. Wake up, eat breakfast, get ready for work, and post a photo of her meal online. Later that day, Jared came home drunk. An argument started and ended abruptly. Around 5 p.m., Jared went to his parents' main house and calmly told them he had a problem. He asked them to come to the guest house where he lived with Angie. The moment they stepped inside, they were horrified. Angie's body lay on the living room floor. She had been decapitated. Blood covered the floors, walls, and even the ceiling. A blood-stained kitchen knife lay nearby, shaken but resolute. Jared's parents did not protect him. They immediately called 911. When police arrived at the guest house, they were stunned by the brutality. Even seasoned officers had never seen such a gruesome scene in their quiet town. Jared was present. He neither fled nor denied responsibility. He confessed to killing his wife, speaking with a disturbing lack of emotion. The police believe Jared was in a compromised state, possibly drunk, high, or experiencing mental health issues. Detectives reconstructed the timeline to understand what led to the tragedy, focusing on Jared's actions before he attacked his wife. Angie. Surveillance cameras showed Jared entering several stores around the city. In one, he walked in barefoot and bought a case of beer. The salesman later said he looked strange but not aggressive. Then he went home, where Angie was waiting. Jared claimed Angie was upset with him, and they argued again. He couldn't clearly remember how the violence began. He said her anger was tied to jealousy and job issues, and he believed he had seen an inappropriate text on her phone. However, a review of Angie's phone found no incriminating messages. She had been texting a co-worker about plans for later that day. Regardless, Jared, under the influence of alcohol and banned substance, became enraged. The situation escalated quickly. Jared grabbed a kitchen knife and attacked Angie. She suffered multiple stab and slash wounds. She showed little sign of defensive injuries, suggesting Jared may have attacked without warning. The medical examiner concluded that when the beheading began, Angie was likely already dead or unconscious from blood loss. The attempted dismemberment intensified the brutality of the crime. It wasn't to hide the body. It appeared intended to desecrate the victim. Forensic teams spent a long time collecting evidence throughout the blood-soaked guest house. They found Angie's head on the floor in a nearby room and gathered dozens of evidence, samples. Blood drops and splatters were everywhere. Examiners confirmed that a common kitchen knife was used for both the murder and the decapitation. Detectives were shocked by Jared's demeanor. He showed no remorse when speaking with police. Jared recounted the graphic details without hesitation or emotion. He even tried to minimize his responsibility, claiming Angie had insulted him, an argument untenable. Given the manner of her death, Angie's body was sent for autopsy, and her family in Nicaragua was notified. Tragically, her family could not afford to travel to the United States or repatriate her remains. The local community responded with compassion and organized a fundraiser. Residents were horrified by the cruelty of the crime and questioned whether it could have been prevented. Strikingly, the crime occurred just a short distance from Jared's parents' home, yet they did not intervene. Jared was taken into custody and cooperated with numerous interrogations. He confessed at the scene and later repeated his account in detail at the station. Even while describing the beheading of his 21-year-old wife, he remained calm, with a soft, even voice, treating the killing as if it were routine. He said their relationship had always involved jealousy and control. He claimed there was no love. He believed she wanted legal stability in the country, and he wanted intimacy. When describing the murder, Jared said that in his rage he felt detached, as if someone else were committing the act, suggesting possible mental issues. Investigators, however, concluded the facts pointed to premeditated murder, not mental illness or intoxication. His actions were deliberate. Notably, before going to his parents to tell them Angie was dead, Jared showered, changed clothes, and then went to a store to buy more alcohol. After confessing, Jared was charged with first-degree murder and held on $500,000 bail. He couldn't afford it, and his parents refused to pay. He was admitted to a mental health monitoring unit due to concerns he might try to harm himself, and was placed under closer supervision. His attorney pursued an insanity defense from the start and requested psychiatric evaluations. While Jared awaited trial, multiple assessments of his mental state were conducted. Preliminary hearings were set for early 2024. Prosecutors argued Jared was competent to stand trial, while the defense sought independent evaluations. Throughout 2023, local residents who cared about Angie held vigils, joined by her colleagues and friends, all describing her as a bright, positive person who did not deserve such a fate. Her body was eventually returned to Nicaragua, where her family held the funeral. Meanwhile, Jared's family has cooperated with the police from the beginning. They were shocked by what he had done and were in regular contact with investigators. For a time, they were even considered possible participants in the abuse Angie suffered, but that suspicion was quickly dismissed. It became clear they had noticed warning signs but did not recognize their seriousness. Hoping marriage would help their son, 4 months after the wedding, Angie was murdered. Neighbors provided valuable information, reporting frequent, heated arguments between the couple. Rumors circulated that the relationship was mutually abusive. A nearby neighbor said he heard their last major argument a few days before the killing. The relationship appeared very toxic. Community members spoke out about the tragedy, noting cultural differences between immigrants and native-born Americans, and warning that rushing into marriage can be an alarming sign. Still, the debate changed little. Despite Jared's confession, the motive for the murder and beheading remained unclear. Many believed substance abuse and untreated mental illness were major factors. This reignited discussions about early detection and intervention for such problems. Jared awaited trial in jail. Prosecutors said they would seek the maximum penalty under Texas law, including the death penalty. The defense leaned heavily on an insanity plea, suggesting Jared had an undiagnosed mental illness. He was described as emotionally unstable, with a long history of banned substance use and likely untreated mental health issues. Prosecutors argued the insanity defense would fail, pointing to Jared's calm demeanor and apparent awareness after the crime as signs of premeditation. They also revealed he had been arrested in November 2022 for drunk driving and released on bail. Citing public safety concerns, they asked to double his $500,000 bail. The judge agreed, and Jared remained in custody following the trial. 23 years old, Jared Dicus was sentenced to 40 years in prison. With eligibility for parole after 20 years, he will be eligible in 2043. Meanwhile, Angie's loved ones in Nicaragua continue to mourn her loss. Thanks to fundraising efforts, her family was able to bring her body home. Her mother gave a Spanish-language interview on a local television channel, tearfully describing Angie as responsible, bright, and devoted to her family. Angie worked tirelessly in the United States and regularly sent money back home. She had dreamed of becoming a nurse. Angie was especially worried about her aunt, who had cancer and lacked access to treatment. Helping her aunt was one of the reasons Angie traveled to the United States. Her story highlights how vulnerable immigration status can make someone. She faced language barriers, struggled to protect herself, and could not fully access support from law enforcement. Jared's actions also devastated his own family. His parents were accused of neglect and indifference, but they insisted they never imagined their son could commit what they call the most brutal crime in Waller County's history. A loud argument broke out in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. Neighbors were used to the screams coming from the house, but tonight it was different. The sounds of screaming, banging, and muffled sobbing grew louder, as if signaling something was about to go too far. Then, just a few minutes later, a call came through the emergency line. The voice on the other end was shaky and broken. as if the caller was in a state of confusion and despair. It was the beginning of one of the most controversial cases the town of Dubuque had ever seen. Dubuque, a city stretched along the banks of the Mississippi River, at first glance looks like a classic Midwestern town with rolling hills, historic districts, and postcard charm. But beneath that surface lies a complicated history. For decades, Dubuque was known as a stronghold of a notorious hate group with deep roots in the region. In the 1922, the group was highly influential, organizing rallies, pressuring local officials, and gaining open support from many white residents. This troubling legacy left scars on the city's social fabric. Entire neighborhoods were divided along racial lines. African American families were pushed into specific areas, and for years, schools and jobs remained largely inaccessible to minorities. Even into the late 20th century, federal reports listed Dubuque as one of the least welcoming places in the country for Black Americans. During the 1982 and 1990s, tensions flared again. Threatening graffiti appeared, homes were targeted with arson, and city leaders were forced to roll out anti-discrimination programs. Still, even in the 21st century, hostility lingered. From street-level aggression to inflammatory posts online, the contrast between Dubuque's picturesque image and its deeper social struggles has always been striking. On one side, historic churches, a respected university, and breathtaking views of the Mississippi. On the other, a legacy of racial intolerance, social friction, and long-standing mistrust between communities. It was in this atmosphere of prejudice and unspoken conflict that a story unfolded, one that would soon draw national attention. Fontainebleau grew up in Dubuque in a well-regarded family. Was known from a young age for his love of sports and natural social charisma. His confidence and charm made him a popular figure among his friends throughout high school and into college. Samantha Link's story was different. Raised in a household that valued hard work, discipline, she turned to athletics early on, pushing herself to prove her strength and determination. In her teens, she was diagnosed with mental health conditions that required ongoing medical supervision and daily medication. While the treatments helped her maintain balance, they also caused mood swings, occasional irritability. She had also endured difficult past relationships marked by control and emotional pressure. That history left deep scars, a fear of losing control, a constant need for reassurance. Outwardly, though, Samantha appeared energetic, someone with clear goals and the willpower to chase them. They first met at a party hosted by their mutual friend Cassie. The night was filled with music and laughter, a seemingly ordinary gathering that turned into a pivotal moment. Fonte was in his element, cracking jokes, drawing people in with his charm. Samantha watched him with a mix of caution and curiosity. When they finally spoke, it quickly became clear they shared similar interests and values. It was obvious something was sparking between them. Within days, casual texts and evening walks blossomed into something more serious. Before long, they decided to move in together. Their friends were surprised at how quickly things escalated. It was as if they had skipped the getting-to-know-you stage entirely and jumped straight into a full-blown commitment. But under one roof, their differences became hard to ignore. Samantha craved stability and a calm home environment where her emotional well-being was prioritized. Fonte, however, clung to his familiar lifestyle, late nights, parties, and constant outings with friends. What felt like neglect to her seemed completely normal to him. Initially, their differences seemed like complementary opposites, creating a fragile sense of balance. However, as time passed, their different needs created problems in the relationship. Their contrasting ideas about what a partnership meant slowly damaged their connection. To outsiders, they still looked like the picture-perfect couple. Fontaine, the charismatic figure who drew attention everywhere he went, and Samantha, the quiet, grounding presence at his side. But those closer to them began to notice early red flags. Samantha grew increasingly uneasy about Fontaine's openness with other women. He, in turn, brushed off her concerns with laughter, dismissing them as jealousy, which only deepened her distrust. On the surface, their relationship remained intact. They still talked about the future, stood by each other during difficult times, and tried to maintain closeness. But beneath that facade, tension was quietly building. For Samantha, being with Fontaine meant a chance at stability, a reliable partner she could depend on. For him, it was more about excitement, attention, and connection. These mismatched intentions became increasingly obvious to those around them. The strain soon began to take its toll. Samantha's life was tightly bound to her medication schedule and regular medical checkups. But Fontaine didn't always take this seriously. He believed his role was to support her during the hard moments, but not to structure his entire life around her needs. Minor frustrations began to stack up. His tardiness, broken promises, and carefree acceptance of party invitations even when she wasn't feeling well. Her sharp reactions often sounded to him like relentless criticism, which he dismissed as overdramatic. She asked more frequently about their future, hoping for reassurance. While he deflected, unwilling to commit to specifics, her anxiety grew, and with it, his irritation. Still, the bond between them didn't disappear. This push and pull, deep attachment, mixed with rising frustration, became the defining pattern of their relationship. After yet another heated argument, Samantha left to stay with her mother, hoping distance would give her clarity. Eventually, though, they agreed to return home together. The car ride back was suffocating, long stretches of silence broken by bursts of blame. Neither wanted to be the first to back down. For Fontaine, this reconciliation felt like a crossroads. He was beginning to realize the relationship had reached its breaking point. Samantha, on the other hand, couldn't hide her anger and pressed him relentlessly, escalating every conversation. Back at the house, peace was short-lived. Within hours, another argument erupted. Samantha demanded proof of his commitment, pleading for reassurance that he was serious about a long-term future. Fontaine answered with cold detachment, saying her expectations were unrealistic and that he felt trapped by her demands. Soon after, he made a decision. Ending the relationship was, in his mind, the only way to escape the emotional weight pressing down on him. He told her directly he no longer saw a future for them. For Samantha, the breakup was devastating. She had built her stability around him and wasn't ready to let go. As emotions spiraled, a new blow landed. A video posted by Fontaine, speaking directly to his audience. He made remarks that could easily be interpreted as thinly veiled references to their problems. To Samantha, it felt like mockery, his way of dismissing her and airing their struggles in public. For her, it was undeniable proof he had no intention of reconciling. What began as emotional strain quickly escalated into confrontation. During one heated dispute, Fontaine reportedly told Samantha he wanted her out of the house, that her presence had become unbearable. This wasn't just a moment of anger. That moment marked a critical tipping point. With his video circulating and their fights intensifying, the fragile balance between them was about to shatter. Later, Fontaine claimed that after their heated argument, Samantha, overwhelmed and emotionally unstable, impulsively grabbed a kitchen knife and injured herself. He insisted it was an act of self-harm, not violence from him. According to his account, he even tried to stop her but failed. But the scene first responders encountered told a very different story. Paramedics arrived to find Samantha lifeless on the kitchen floor, bearing 3 stab wounds to vital areas. The placement of her body and the nature of the wounds simply did not align with Fonte's version. While medics worked desperately to save her, officers observed Fonte closely. What they saw was not shock or grief, but hostility. Witnesses later recalled him shouting at police, arguing with them, and displaying aggressive, confrontational behavior. To officers, it was a clear signal this was no mere domestic dispute. It was something far more serious. Once in custody, Fonte's statements immediately raised red flags. When pressed for details about the timing of events and his exact actions, his answers were vague, inconsistent, and often shifted under scrutiny. Detectives quickly suspected he was concealing the truth. Then came the most damning discovery: his phone. A recording captured just before the incident revealed a tense atmosphere filled with threats and aggression from Fonte. Far from calm or composed, his voice dripped with hostility. The tone of the video stood in stark contrast to his claim that he had only tried to protect Samantha, shredding his credibility. Text messages recovered from the device added another layer. They showed days of heated arguments, accusations, and emotional tension. The incident was clearly the culmination of ongoing turmoil. Medical examiners reinforced this conclusion. They determined Samantha's injuries were consistent with a violent struggle, not self-inflicted wounds. The angle, depth, and force of the stabs made the prospect of self-harm virtually impossible. Investigators gathered more evidence from neighbors and nearby security cameras. Multiple residents reported hearing terrified screams that night. Every new piece of testimony pointed away from self-harm and toward a brutal confrontation. Fonte's explanation now looked less like truth and more like a hastily constructed defense. From the very beginning, Samantha's family had voiced their doubts. They told investigators she had never expressed self-harm thoughts and was focused on her future. Her mother, especially, emphasized that Samantha had plans, goals, and no history of impulsive self-harm. Their testimony directly contradicted Fonte's attempt to paint her as unstable. As the investigation deepened, public reaction intensified. Local media covered the story closely, and on social media, outrage spread rapidly. Many in the community saw Fonte's narrative as a desperate attempt to deflect blame. For Samantha's loved ones, it was not just about disproving his claims, it was about demanding justice. What began as a domestic dispute had now escalated into one of the most scrutinized criminal cases in the area. Each revelation fueled public anger and strengthened the resolve of Samantha's family, ensuring the case would not fade quietly, but remain a test of truth, justice, and accountability. A series of meticulous forensic examinations were commissioned in an effort to clarify the circumstances of the tragedy. Medical specialists carefully assessed the wounds sustained by Samantha Link, noting striking details. The injuries varied in depth, direction, and force, suggesting multiple blows delivered during a struggle. Psychological evaluations added further weight to the findings. Records showed that Samantha had never been diagnosed with a serious mental disorder, nor was she under ongoing psychiatric observation. There was no documented history of instability that could support the claim she had acted in a sudden breakdown. These conclusions marked a turning point in the investigation. Combined with the digital evidence and testimony from friends and neighbors, they dismantled the defense's early narrative. The consensus among experts was unequivocal. The theory that Samantha harmed herself was implausible. For prosecutors, it was the foundation they needed to push the case toward trial with renewed confidence. When the trial of Fonte Buello commenced in Rockwell County, Texas, anticipation was high. Locals were unfamiliar with such a sensational case. The court was packed with onlookers, reporters, and local residents eager to witness the proceedings. The judge presided, a figure known for his rigid style and no-nonsense rulings. His choice to restrict discussion about Samantha's prior psychological consultations sparked immediate debate. By prohibiting references to her visits with mental health professionals, he effectively blocked the jury from hearing evidence that might have offered a fuller understanding of her emotional state. Many legal observers criticized the ruling as a limitation that tilted the balance of the case. In the courtroom, the prosecution leaned heavily on science. They highlighted bruises on Samantha's arms and shoulders, injuries that clearly pointed to restraint or physical conflict rather than voluntary harm. Crime scene photographs revealed a kitchen in disarray, with blood patterns that supported the scenario of a violent struggle. These details left jurors with a vivid image of the chaos that had unfolded. The defense countered with a familiar strategy, portraying Fonte as a man trapped in an escalating situation. They argued he had acted in self-defense after Samantha lashed out during an emotional outburst. Text messages were presented as evidence of her volatility. But those arguments were steadily eroded by witnesses who painted a different picture. Samantha's friends testified she was looking ahead, discussing a new job opportunity and planning an upcoming trip. Evidence that directly contradicted claims she was unstable or preparing to harm herself. The most dramatic moment came when prosecutors played an audio recording recovered from Fonte's phone. His voice could be heard, sharp and cutting. To the prosecution, this was the sound of frustration boiling over, a precursor to violence. The defense tried to minimize its significance, calling it a casual remark taken out of context. However, both the jury and the public seemed to interpret the recording as part of a larger pattern of tension and conflict. Meanwhile, Fonte's conduct on the stand left jurors uneasy. He stumbled over timelines, contradicted earlier statements, and often refused to give direct answers. Each inconsistency further damaged his credibility, reinforcing the prosecution's portrait of a man trying to obscure the truth rather than reveal it. As proceedings dragged on, the divide between prosecution and defense sharpened. One side presented a case built on consistency, expert testimony, and hard evidence. The other leaned on speculation and selective interpretation. But the most decisive battles took place behind closed doors. Jury deliberations quickly grew heated, with members split between doubt and certainty. Some pressed for conviction, citing the overwhelming medical evidence, while others hesitated, swayed by lingering questions. Reports later surfaced of intense internal pressure. A letter written by juror admitted he felt coerced, not only by more assertive jurors, but also by the judge, who repeatedly urged them to reach consensus rather than deadlock. The judge's role itself became a focal point. Far from remaining neutral, he was seen pushing the jury toward unity, interrupting defense attorneys, and shutting down lines of questioning that might have benefited Fonte. Journalists covering the trial described a courtroom where judicial authority sometimes overshadowed fairness, creating an imbalance that would later resurface during appeals. The public's interest in the case intensified outside the courthouse. Samantha's family spoke often to the media, portraying her as a victim of manipulation and violence, and Fonte as the perpetrator. Local newspapers published emotional stories about Samantha's last days, with quotes from friends, family highlighting her kindness and strength. A critical moment arrived when previously undisclosed messages from Samantha's personal conversations were introduced in court. These texts revealed her intention to leave the relationship and focus on building a new future for herself. For prosecutors, it was devastating to the defense's claims. Any suggestion that she was unstable or incapable of making decisions collapsed under the weight of her own words. The jury was no longer weighing competing versions of events. They were already considering the severity of the punishment. Internal pressure within the jury room and the judge's firm stance had shifted the momentum firmly toward the prosecution. After weeks of testimony, forensic evidence, and conflicting legal arguments, the courtroom braced for the final moment. The atmosphere was tense enough to silence the crowd. The judge read the verdict aloud. Fontaine was found guilty of the charges against Samantha Link and sentenced to 50 years in prison. A heavy silence filled the room, followed by a wave of mixed reactions. Fontaine didn't outwardly panic upon hearing the sentence, but the strain on his face was unmistakable. He had denied responsibility throughout the trial, and even in the face of the final ruling, he continued to maintain his innocence. His immediate response was to announce plans to appeal the decision, claiming that the evidence had been misinterpreted and that the full context of that night had not been fairly considered. Samantha's family was visibly relieved by the verdict. They felt justice had been served, though they still grieved an irreplaceable loss. Family members in the courtroom cried openly, thanked the prosecutors and the court, expressing that the verdict brought them a long-awaited sense of closure. Public reaction, however, was far more divided. Many believed the sentence was just and reflected the strength of the evidence presented. Others questioned the fairness of the trial, arguing that media pressure and courtroom imbalances had stacked the odds against Fontaine from the beginning. His supporters pointed to specific grievances, such as the controversial removal of a juror and restrictions imposed on defense, claiming the process was tainted and should have been declared a mistrial. In the weeks following sentencing, the community itself split into camps. Some viewed Fontaine as a manipulative offender who had finally been held accountable. Others saw him as a man condemned by a system, eager for a conviction. Advocacy groups began forming, calling for a review of the case, while counter voices argued that the evidence was overwhelming and that reopening the matter would only prolong the suffering of Samantha's family. Rather than closing the book, the verdict ignited a fresh round of debate. To his critics, Fontaine embodied cold-blooded violence. To his supporters, he was another casualty of a flawed judicial system. His attorneys moved quickly, filing notices of appeal and alleging serious procedural missteps. They argued that video footage used in court had been stripped of context, twisting casual remarks into sinister threats. They also claimed investigators had targeted Fontaine as the prime suspect from the beginning, refusing to explore other possibilities. The appeals court agreed to review the case, but the process promised to be long and arduous. Meanwhile, Fontaine remained behind bars, his supporters organizing rallies and online campaigns in his name. To some, it was a fight for justice. To others, it was nothing more than a desperate attempt to rewrite a verdict that had already been decided. As preparations for the appeal advanced, the defense team brought in independent experts to bolster their version of events. Forensic psychologists and criminal investigators were introduced, some of whom argued that, under extreme emotional distress, the wounds on Samantha's body could be interpreted as self-inflicted. Another specialist pointed out that there were no direct eyewitnesses to the fatal altercation, suggesting the jury had relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. The prosecution quickly countered with its own battery of experts. They emphasized the directionality of blood spatter, the precise angles of the wounds, and the position of Samantha's body in the kitchen, all details that strongly indicated the injuries had been inflicted by someone else. Meanwhile, the media shifted its focus beyond the courtroom, digging into the couple's personal history. Old social media posts resurfaced. Friends and co-workers were interviewed, and new details began to circulate. Some accounts portrayed Samantha as someone who had voiced repeated concerns about Fontaine's temper and controlling behavior. Others painted a different picture, describing her as impulsive and occasionally volatile during moments of stress. The result was a battle of interpretations, not just between lawyers, but also among experts, journalists, and the public. Some professionals argued that the case had leaned too heavily on inference and lacked a definitive smoking gun. Others maintained that the convergence of evidence, from forensic findings to text messages, made the guilty verdict both justified and necessary. This division transformed the trial into more than just a legal proceeding. It became a cultural flashpoint. Talk shows debated it nightly, editorials dissected every new revelation, and online forums buzzed with arguments from both sides. By now, the case had transcended the courtroom. Investigative journalists kept the story alive with follow-up reports, some uncovering financial disputes related to Samantha's estate, others highlighting conflicts within her family. Social media intensified the polarization, with advocacy groups springing up in support of Fonte, convinced he was the victim of a miscarriage of justice, while opposing groups rallied to defend the verdict as a long-overdue act of accountability. In the end, the saga of Fonte and Samantha became more than the tragic story of two people. It stood as one of the most polarizing legal battles of its time, a case that revealed cracks in the justice system, stirred debates within professional circles, and split public opinion down the middle. Long after the courtroom lights dimmed, the case remained etched into collective memory, both as a cautionary tale and as a cultural mirror reflecting society's deepest division. Binghamton, a small, peaceful city in New York State, was once so safe that many families did not need to lock their doors when they went to bed. Children rode their bikes, delivered newspapers, played in the parks. Adults lived slowly and trusted each other. In that place, crime seems a distant thing. But on the afternoon of March 26, 1984, that peace was shattered. A 12-year-old girl disappeared on a familiar street while delivering newspapers. The whole city was in a panic. Hundreds of people rushed to search for her, but to no avail. Until the police opened the door, leading to a dark basement in a seemingly innocuous house, they were faced with a gruesome sight. The girl's body lay there, wrapped in an old blanket, with traces of the crime imprinted on the walls. From that moment on, Binghamton was no longer mentioned as a peaceful city. So, who was the killer, and how could such horror hide behind the walls of an ordinary home? To find the answer, stay with us until the very end of this video. Cherry Lindsay was born on June 6, 1971, in Binghamton, New York, USA. She was one of 4 children. Her father worked in law enforcement, and her mother was a homemaker. Since childhood, she has been a creative, dynamic person and actively participates in community activities. She played the clarinet in the school orchestra, enjoyed board games and softball, and even joined the school's softball team. Despite her busy schedule, she also volunteers at the neonatal unit of a local hospital and volunteers with the American Veterans Association. She dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, neonatologist, or nurse, and she studied and worked hard toward those goals. At age 12, she was in 7th grade and earning good grades. In her free time, Cherry took a part-time job delivering newspapers because she wanted to help others. She planned to save her earnings to throw a party for her favorite teacher, who was expecting a baby. By early 1984, she had been delivering newspapers for about a month. Following a regular route along 2 neighboring streets near her home, residents appreciated her reliability and politeness. She always delivered on time. In the 1,980 seconds, Binghamton was considered a safe city, and many people didn't lock their doors or windows. Cherry's family lives in an area with a low crime rate. Still, her mother often accompanied her on paper routes, and her father, a police officer, encouraged people to be vigilant. On Monday, March 26, 1984, Cherry's mother stayed home to prepare a special dinner and couldn't accompany her. Cherry came home after school and left to deliver papers around 3:30 p.m., promising to return in about an hour so she could call a friend. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. Her mother later carried lifelong guilt for letting her go alone that day. At 4:30 p.m., the phone rang. It was a neighbor boy, a friend of Cherry's, asking to speak with her. Realizing that Cherry hadn't returned as promised, and knowing how punctual she always was, her mother grew concerned. She tried to stay calm, thinking that Cherry might have lost track of time while talking to someone, but she informed her husband. He immediately notified fellow officers to be vigilant and report anything unusual. Following his instructions, Cherry's mother began calling her daughter's friends and relatives. They checked with Cherry's aunt, to whom she was very close, but she hadn't seen her. An hour passed with no news. No one knows where Cherry is, and her parents are very worried. No one had seen Cherry since she left on her regular paper route. Her father and other officers couldn't wait any longer. They began searching the area, focusing on the 2 streets where she usually walked. They also spoke with people along the route, including Cherry's friends. Her best friend reported that they had seen each other from across the street earlier that day and exchanged a quick wave. Cherry stayed focused on her deliveries and didn't stop to chat. This sighting helped investigators narrow down the timeline of her disappearance. The last time anyone saw Cherry was around 4:00 p.m. She was alone, and witnesses noticed nothing unusual. Some people assumed she had gone to visit friends and would return soon. Her parent disagreed. She was a homebody, never went out without permission, and all her belongings were still in her room. By 7:00 p.m., her father, himself a police officer, and other officers had interviewed most residents on the 2 streets where Cherry usually delivered newspapers. They found nothing useful. That evening, the police department alerted the entire city, bringing more officers into the search. By the next morning, firefighters, county and state police, Nina units, and a police helicopter joined in. The search area expanded into the outskirts, but no trace of Cherry was found. Her father was one of the most active searchers. He frequently called home, hoping Cherry had returned, and it was all a misunderstanding. Each time, his wife tearfully told him there was no news, until she remembered something important. She recalled that during her paper route, Cherry was afraid of a house 7 blocks away. A man there always stared at her in a way that gave her goosebumps. Cherry mentioned it to her mother repeatedly. Her father took this lead seriously. Police went to the house, but no one answered the door, and it seemed empty. Without cause to force entry, they had to leave. He kept the address in mind. About 30 hours of unsuccessful searching passed. With no new information, police held a press conference to draw public attention. Several tips came in, but all were dead ends. Soon after, the previously absent resident of that house appeared. Detectives went to see him. He is James Wales, 35 years old. He lives a quiet, normal life and rarely attracts attention. He remembered Cherry, who had delivered his papers, but said he hadn't seen her in days and didn't know where she was. There was no basis to arrest him, but detectives found him unsettling and took interest. With no other leads, they began to focus on him. News of the suspicious resident spread. A local journalist visited James, who let him in and answered questions about Cherry, though he seemed reluctant and quickly grew nervous. The journalist reported his concerns to police. On March 27, 1984, Cherry's father ran a records check on James. He had no serious criminal history, only prior incidents of drunk driving and trespassing. The trespassing occurred years earlier when drunk after leaving a bar. He wandered into a field a few kilometers from home. No one was harmed, and he received a warning. A deeper look revealed something more troubling. Years before Cherry went missing, James lived in Normandy, New York. The files show that the parents of a boy once filed a complaint alleging that James committed abuse. The case was transferred to social services and then closed without law enforcement action. He was never charged. These findings increased suspicion that he might be involved in Cherry's disappearance. Detectives met with him again. They noted he was unusually nervous, dodged direct questions, and avoided eye contact, especially when asked about Cherry, further heightening their concern. Despite James denying he saw Cherry on the day she disappeared, detectives brought him to the station for formal questioning. There, detectives found James uncomfortable communicating, unwilling to cooperate, and almost immediately requested a lawyer. While James was being questioned, his wife also spoke to the police. Convinced that her husband had nothing to do with Cherry's disappearance, she agreed to have her home searched. Investigators soon found a paper bag matching the one Cherry used for her newspapers and Cherry's earrings in a dresser drawer. 2 hours later, the search continued. A detective went down to the basement and discovered what looked like dried blood. In the back of the room, they found a blanket wrapped around a girl's body. It was 12 years old, Cherry Lindsay. She was dead. Meanwhile, at the station, James continued to deny any involvement. James admitted he knew Cherry. Like other neighbors, he received newspapers from her and described her as very punctual. He offered nothing else. When informed about the discovery in his home, he stopped cooperating. Detectives believed his resistance wouldn't last. About 90 minutes later, James confessed. He said Cherry had delivered the newspaper and he lured her inside. She screamed immediately. He tried to silence her by covering her mouth, but she fought back and he began strangling her. As Cherry struggled harder, he grew enraged, grabbed a table leg, and struck her head several times. She lost consciousness, but was still alive. He tied her hands behind her back, stuffed her t-shirt in her mouth, opened the basement door, and threw her down the stairs. Cherry sustained more injuries in the fall. James followed her downstairs, wrapped a clothesline around her neck, and continued strangling her for several minutes. When she showed no signs of life, he abused her without removing the rope. He claimed he had not intended to kill her and blamed the attack on uncontrollable, impulsive violence. He then returned to his routine, finished cooking dinner, and went back to the basement. About 15 minutes later, unsure if Cherry was dead, he used the rope still around her neck to make certain. He hung her from a sewer pipe for about half an hour. Afterward, he wrapped her body, clothes, and some belongings in a blanket, collected her newspapers and the money she had earned that day, showered, changed, and removed the clothes he had worn during the crime. He went to the basement several more times to check if she was dead. His calm, detached description of these actions suggested a complete lack of remorse. Ironically, 35 years old, James was the same man who had helped Cherry with her paper route. Though Cherry had found him creepy and strange and was wary of him, he had shown her the route for delivering newspapers. Investigators now suspect this was part of a plan to gain her trust and lure her to her death. To understand how he came to commit such a crime, police examined his background. They quickly learned James's life was marked by violence. His father died when he was young. His stepfather was abusive and drank heavily. His mother, also an alcoholic, joined in punishing him rather than protecting him. James started drinking in school and later used illegal substances. James was a troubled teenager who repeatedly tried to flee his abusive parents. Despite multiple reports of domestic violence, law enforcement took no action. At 17, He finally escaped from his mother and stepfather and enlisted in the United States of America Army. He served for 6 years and earned honors and awards. He returned to Norway in 1972 and married 3 times. His last wife was Sue Ellen. They had 2 children and, for a time, lived a normal life. After leaving the army, he worked at International Business Machines, but lost his job in 1983 due to long-standing alcohol and banned substance abuse. After being fired, his mental health deteriorated. His wife tried to support him, but they never sought professional help. He displayed paranoia and delusions, yet no official diagnosis was made, and he received no treatment. According to his wife and witnesses, he was a ticking time bomb, warnings that went unheeded until it was too late. Investigators later discovered that James had an unexpected accomplice. He had not forced Cherry into his house. She went there willingly. However, her family insisted that she would never have gone with such a suspicious man of her own accord. James had used his 11-year-old stepson, Brian. Knowing approximately when Cherry delivered newspapers, James watched for a moment when she was alone. When he saw her without her mother, he told Brian to help. Brian, who knew Cherry, invited her inside. During police questioning, Brian admitted that James had ordered him to do this. As soon as Cherry entered, James appeared and told Brian to leave. The boy ran to his upstairs room. He feared something terrible would happen, but stayed silent out of fear. After James confessed to the murder, police returned to the house to gather corroborating evidence in case he later recanted. Inside, they found Cherry's newspapers and the money she had collected, both stolen by James. Blood on the basement floor and wall indicated she had been beaten and thrown down the stairs. They recovered a blood-stained sewer pipe used to hang her, along with pieces of clothesline and fragments of her clothing. Evidence also showed the murder was premeditated. Before Cherry began her paper route, James did not subscribe to that newspaper. He subscribed only after she started working. Witnesses said he fixated on her, even following and observing her route. Based on this evidence, on April 6, 1984, James Wales was charged with second-degree murder, abuse, kidnapping, burglary, and abuse of a corpse. He was arrested, held in the county jail, and denied bail as a particularly dangerous offender. Unable to afford an attorney, he was assigned a public defender. The defense first sought his release on bail and requested a change of venue due to extensive local publicity that could compromise an impartial jury. Both requests were denied. The defense then filed an insanity plea. In 1984, the state governor signed a bill revising the standard for insanity defenses, shifting the burden to showing the defendant did not understand right from wrong. The attorney believed this was James's only chance to avoid a life sentence. The trial, initially set for July 30, 1984, was postponed multiple times at the defense's request. The trial finally began on October 18, 1984. The prosecutor presented detailed evidence: the rope used to strangle Cherry, a table leg with her blood, and James's confession, which he later tried to retract by claiming insanity. The evidence also included the newspapers and money he took after the murder. During the hearing, a defense psychiatrist testified that he believed James was insane, diagnosing him with intermittent explosive disorder, a relatively common condition marked by unpredictable anger and violent outbursts. At the time, about 200,000 people in the United States had been diagnosed with this disorder. According to the expert, James could not resist his impulses to do harm. The psychiatrist said that during multiple meetings with James in jail, he observed a range of disturbing symptoms. In one session, James claimed that during the murder, he believed he was attacking his mother, not Cherry. He blamed his mother for his abusive childhood, hated her and wanted revenge. The psychiatrist concluded that James was unable to consider the consequences of his actions or control himself at the time of the crime. Two of James's ex-wives also testified. They said he had a tendency toward violence that could take disturbing forms. For example, James likes to strangle during intimacy and has a hard time stopping. The court then heard a detailed account of the murder and the horrors Cherry endured. Cherry's parents struggled to listen. The medical examiner testified that it took about 30 minutes for her to die from strangulation. Based on James's own timeline, even when he hung Cherry in the basement, she may still have been alive. Brian also testified against James. These events were deeply traumatic for 11-year-old Brian. He said he heard screams and muffled thuds. Cherry cried for help, and then it went quiet. Brian was too scared to leave the room because he knew how cruel James could be. He feared he would be attacked next. After 11 days of trial, the jury began deliberations. Notably, the jury did not see all the evidence investigators gathered. The judge excluded crime scene photos of Cherry, her torn clothing, and the marks left on her body, believing such shocking images might prevent the jury from remaining impartial. After 3 hours and 15 minutes, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts. The insanity defense failed. On November 12 of that year, James Wales was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 33 years, the maximum allowed by state law. In his final statement, he said he was sorry, but it sounded unconvincing, as throughout the trial, James remained impassive and showed no emotion. When issuing the sentence, the judge, citing the brutality of the crime, urged the state never to grant James parole. However, James qualified for the first time in 2017. Cherry's parents could not accept this loss. They moved out of the family home and eventually put it up for sale. By then, the house had a grim reputation. Many believed Cherry's spirit was unsettled and that strange events occurred there. The house became known as haunted. Twice, new residents abandoned it, and neighbors reported moving objects, voix, and unexplained sounds. On July 30, 2020, the ghost house was demolished. At that moment, Cherry's mother also discarded her daughter's newspaper bag, deciding it was finally time to let her go. Cherry's father, however, believed her spirit would only be at peace once the killer died behind bars. The city council honored Cherry's memory in 1984 by naming a local park after her and installing a small memorial there. James was first granted parole on April 12, 2017. Like any American inmate, he could appear before a parole board, and he exercised that right. His hearings were met with public protests organized by Cherry's parents. James told the board he struggled with stress, had a difficult childhood due to his abusive grandfather, and believed he would never have killed Cherry if not for a mental health crisis. Despite his statements, the parole board denied his release. Cherry's parents continued to hold public demonstrations, calling for him to remain imprisoned for life. Ahead of each new hearing, they intensified their efforts to seek justice for their daughter. 3 years later, James became eligible for parole again. A supporter of Cherry and her family launched an online petition that gathered more than 9,000 signatures. In total, 409 pages of signatures and 120 pages of comments were submitted to the board. James was denied parole a second time. And again, in 2023, law enforcement maintained that he should remain behind bars for life. Another hearing was scheduled for 2025. Throughout this period, Cherry's family appealed to the public, doing everything they could to prevent his release. On February 28, 2023, Cherry's father died at age 81 after a brief battle with liver cancer. Before his death, he asked that James never be released. In 2025, James was denied parole again. The next hearing is scheduled for 2 years later. Cherry's mother and others fear that in 2027, the board may consider releasing James, in part because of the terminal illness he has suffered from for years. Although the family's leading advocate, Cherry's father, has passed away, his cause continues online and in person. Many supporters, including Cherry's mother, remain determined to ensure that James is never released from prison. Betrayal doesn't always come with raised voices or broken vows. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as love and care, a glass of water, a vitamin handed at bedtime, a calm voice saying everything will be fine. For Hannah, that betrayal came from the one person she trusted most, her husband. As Hannah weakened day by day, Brian was more than her caretaker. He was the source of her suffering. Behind his polished image as a chiropractor and devoted father, he had set up a financial plan not for their future, but for the time after her death. He'd taken out multiple life insurance policies totaling over $1 million, all listing him as the sole beneficiary. What looked like devotion was, in truth, calculation. What seemed like protection was exploitation. And in the end, the man who vowed to cherish his wife in sickness and in health used her sickness as the path to his own fortune. This is the story of a marriage that became a contract of death, where love was poisoned for profit. Hannah lived in Decatur, Alabama, in a home organized entirely around her children's routines. Her days revolved around early wake-ups, daycare drop-offs, meals, naps, and evening activities. She manages the household and works part-time as a skincare specialist, sometimes seeing clients at home, sometimes at a guest house. She did not pursue a steady full-time career. Her husband, Brian Mann, was the family's financial breadwinner, allowing her to focus on housework and raising the children. They married in 2018. By the time of these events, Hannah was in her early 20s. Brian, her husband, was a local chiropractor who ran his own practice. Brian's clinic had a reputation for order and professionalism, friendly receptionists, spotless rooms, and strict scheduling. Patients praised his attentive consultations, personalized treatment plans, and reliable follow-up for chronic conditions. His strong reputation brought steady referrals, and the community trusted him. Brian's family lived simply but comfortably. Supported by the clinic's income, big expenses were planned in advance. But when it came to the children, they didn't hesitate to spend. Neighbors saw a neat house, a well-kept yard, weekend outings, all painted a picture of a perfect life. Successful husband, good wife, 2 young children, a peaceful lifestyle, but inside, things were more rigid than they seemed. Brian controlled many domestic decisions and gradually isolated Hannah from others. After the wedding, her meetups with friends dwindled. Appointments were often postponed or cancelled because of inconvenience, bad timing, or no one to look after the kids. She left social media and was eventually locked out of her accounts. Brian said it was for privacy and safety. He kept access to their shared email and passwords. He handled nearly all household administration, subscriptions, bills, appointments, while Hannah's days were consumed by home tasks. Mornings were for getting everyone else ready. Afternoons went to errands, cooking, and laundry. Evenings followed the children's schedules. She rarely visited the clinic, and only when necessary. Brian told others, and likely himself, that everything was under control. He cited his medical background at home too. Advice on sleep, vitamins, and nutrition. Appearing deeply involved in family life, that's how it looked. A well-ordered life, growing control within the household, and the slow erasure of Hannah's personal space. In mid-2021, a change came that seemed harmless at first. Leveraging his role as a health professional, Brian suggested Hannah start a daily vitamin regimen tailored to support her as a busy mother with little time to rest. He said the supplements came from his clinic, ensuring quality and safety. They were chewable gummies and powdered drinks. Trusting his advice, Hannah accepted it as a routine wellness step. Soon it was habit. Each evening, Brian brought the supplements to the bedroom with a glass of water. If she forgot, he gently reminded her, stressing consistency and promising benefits with regular use. His persistence looked like care. A few weeks later, Hannah began to notice slight changes in her body. Fatigue, dizziness. She attributed it to the workload of housework and childcare. Gradually, the symptoms became more severe. Back pain, frequent stomach pain. Her diet hadn't changed, yet she was losing weight. By the end of summer, her clothes hung loosely. Even though she hadn't tried to slim down, Brian stayed calm. As Hannah's symptoms emerged, he told her that her body was adjusting to improved nutrition, that any side effects were temporary, and that she would feel stronger within a few months. He spoke with absolute confidence, drawing on his medical background. Hannah wasn't alarmed. Her symptoms developed slowly, without any sudden crisis. Occasional good days made her think she might be recovering. Even as her energy declined and her weight continued to drop, it was this period that laid the foundation for a health condition that quickly became serious and dangerous. By late summer 2021, Hannah's condition had worsened significantly. Nausea set in, making it difficult to eat regularly. From September 2021 to January 2022, she lost nearly 40 pounds, dropping to about 84 pounds. Even doing daily housework left her breathless and exhausted. Standing in the kitchen for long was hard. She felt dizzy and had lower back pain. Stairs exhausted her. Eventually, she struggled to stay balanced and began using a rolling office chair to move around the house to reduce strain and avoid falls. Nighttime muscle cramps increased, and her sleep became shallow and restless. Despite Hannah's obvious decline in health, Brian discouraged her from seeking medical attention. He insisted he could manage her routine himself and framed her symptoms as the stress of parenting, seasonal fatigue, and lack of sleep, saying they didn't require professional attention. At the same time, Brian tightened control over the household. He decided when Hannah should rest, reminded her to take the supplements he provided, and personally brought her water to keep her on his schedule. He recommended at-home remedies, more rest, hydration, and light stretches, demonstrating them as safe and effective. He stayed soft-spoken and attentive, projecting care. By late fall, fatigue overshadowed everything else. Lifting her son and daughter became difficult. Hannah often asked them to wait while she sat to catch her breath. She had to spread out chores. Simple tasks took hours. By December, the contrast between how she looked and how she felt was clear. Her clothes hung loose and her face looked sunken. Yet her temperature was normal. Adding to the confusion, she knew she was getting worse but couldn't understand why. Her diet and workload hadn't changed. By early January 2022, Hannah was in crisis. Standing caused sudden weakness and brief vision blurring. Eating was a struggle. Food sometimes repulsed her, and a few bites could trigger nausea. Moving around without support became dangerous. She relied on the rolling chair to get from room to room. Still, Brian remained steadfast. He kept saying, "The worst is over," insisting she just needed more time to recover. He stayed calm, managed details, issued reminders, and spoke with unwavering confidence. When Hannah's condition became life-threatening, she did not seek help on her own. Her mother, visiting occasionally, recognized the danger and decided to act without telling Brian. Hannah could barely walk. so her mother helped her dress and guided her to the car. On the way to the hospital, Hannah said little, mostly describing abdominal pain and extreme weakness. At the University of Alabama Hospital emergency room, her mother immediately told staff that her condition had been deteriorating for months without medical care. Doctors began by checking the basics: weight, blood pressure, temperature, and heart rate. The results were alarming. Hannah's weight was dangerously low, her pulse was weak, and her blood pressure was unstable. Physicians initially considered a broad range of causes, from chronic conditions to serious systemic illnesses, and ordered extensive lab tests and diagnostic procedures. Blood work revealed a critical finding: Hannah's blood lead level was about 80 micrograms per deciliter. For comparison, anything above 10 is medically concerning. Her level posed an immediate, life-threatening risk. Additional tests showed signs of internal organ distress, and she soon developed acute respiratory failure. Doctors placed her on a ventilator to support her breathing. Imaging scans revealed fine, metallic-like particles throughout her tissues. Lead deposits accumulated over time from ongoing exposure rather than a single event. This chronic exposure explained her gradual symptoms and the sudden crisis. Once her condition became critical, her health declined so quickly that doctors induced a medical coma to reduce physiological stress and prevent permanent damage. Treatment began immediately with chelation therapy to bind and remove the lead. Progress was slow and required continuous monitoring. Hannah remained hospitalized for nearly 2 months. During that time, the team stabilized her breathing, improved her vital signs, and lowered her blood lead levels. Still, the damage from prolonged exposure was evident, and full recovery was unlikely. Doctors emphasized that even a one-day delay might have been fatal. Hannah's survival ultimately hinged on her mother's decision to act, breaking from the family's usual pattern and enabling a timely diagnosis and urgent treatment. Once the diagnosis was confirmed, the hospital notified the Morgan County Department of Human Resources, which then alerted state investigators in Alabama. Specialists in toxic metal exposure took the case. Their first step was to test Hannah's family home for environmental sources of lead. They began in the kitchen and bathrooms, collecting water samples from every faucet and removing filters for analysis. They documented the condition of the plumbing and dishware used for food and drinks. Investigators also collected paint chips from older surfaces, dust samples, and soil from outside. They reviewed pantry items, including foods and nutritional products given to the children. Brian cooperated, pointing out the vitamin supplements Hannah had been taking from his clinic. He also suggested fast food as a possible source of exposure. Investigators documented his comments, but quickly ruled out that theory. With a blood lead level near 80 micrograms per deciliter, other cases would likely have appeared, yet no similar local incidents were reported. Furthermore, Brian and their other children showed no signs of lead exposure, undermining the idea of common environmental source. Initial lab tests of the home's water, paint, dust, pantry items, and nutritional products showed no hazardous lead levels or notable abnormalities. At this point, investigators had found no typical household source of contamination. They recommended testing for all household members. Brian reported that his son and daughter's results were normal and said he would complete his own testing later at a separate facility. His delay raised concerns, especially since some tests could have been done immediately on site. This was flagged for follow-up. A second home inspection occurred a few days later, with experts from the Alabama Department of Public Health expanding the scope of testing. They collected water from initial flow and post-flush samples, gathered dust from multiple surfaces, inspected filters, and took swabs from the kitchen's sink, kettle, and blender to check for metal leaching. Investigators also requested packaging from the vitamins and powder mixes to identify the manufacturer and batch numbers. The second round of results reinforced the initial findings. There was no source of lead in the home environment. However, the source and composition of Hannah's supplements remained unclear because the investigators did not have access to actual samples. They began to reconstruct Hannah's daily routine by talking to her family and close contacts. They focused on who prepared the meals and especially the timing, location, frequency, and context in which Hannah took the supplements. The family reported that Brian regularly reminded Hannah to take them in the evening. At home, with a glass of water he left by her bed. These details supported a working theory of intentional oral exposure. The initial stages of the investigation revealed three main findings. There was no evidence of lead contamination in the home environment. The hypothesis of exposure through eating at restaurants was not supported by any definitive data. Further consideration of factors related to dietary supplement use, particularly Brian's direct role, warranted further scrutiny. As a result, investigators shifted their attention to Brian, verifying his statements and checking whether he had access to lead outside the home. After Hannah was hospitalized, Brian arrived at the hospital claiming he had performed a self-exam. He said he used X-ray equipment at his own clinic and believed he saw a foreign substance in his body that could be lead. This claim puzzled the medical team. Self-diagnosing with X-rays is highly unorthodox, and using clinic equipment for personal testing is not standard practice. Physicians insisted he undergo a full, independent evaluation. When Brian realized the hospital would conduct the tests, he became visibly anxious. Screening confirmed the presence of lead in his system, but only at a low level, consistent with very recent exposure, too low to cause symptoms and not indicative of long-term accumulation. This is in stark contrast to Hannah's results, which showed clear evidence of prolonged exposure at high levels over several months. Experts concluded that Brian had likely ingested lead shortly before coming to the hospital to present himself as a fellow victim. This may have been an attempt to appear proactive and concerned, but the exposure timeline did not match and undermined his story. Interviews with colleagues and acquaintances further showed that Brian exhibited no symptoms of chronic lead exposure throughout Hannah's illness. His behavior and physical condition remained normal. To investigators, this strongly suggested Hannah's poisoning was not accidental. The pattern pointed to deliberate poisoning with no apparent risk to other family members. Brian's attempt to cast himself as a victim only deepened suspicion. Authorities believed he was trying to divert attention from the central issue, how lead had been entering Hannah's body over an extended period. In summer 2022, a contractor who had worked for Brian the previous year contacted investigators. He reported that in 2021, he had installed an X-ray room at Brian's clinic, lining the walls with lead sheets. After completion, leftover lead sheets and scraps remained. According to the contractor, Brian asked that the unused pieces be left behind, saying he would handle them. At the time, this seemed routine. Brian owned the clinic and had paid for the materials, but after learning of Hannah's diagnosis, the contractor reconsidered. He gave an official statement to police. Investigators compared his account with Hannah's medical timeline and found a match. Her symptoms worsened markedly in August 2021. Shortly after the clinic renovation was completed, the dates aligned. Brian gained access to lead just before Hannah's prolonged illness began. This gave investigators a documented external source of the toxic metal separate from the family's home. The contractor on the clinic project provided a detailed timeline from start to final cleanup. He explained standard procedures. Leftover materials are either returned to the warehouse or disposed of safely. He did not see what Brian did with the remaining lead. He simply handed it to him at the clinic owner's request. Investigators obtained the service agreement start and completion dates, and a full materials list confirming both the timing and presence of lead-based shielding. Clinic staff reported that only Brian had keys to the X-ray room and that the post-installation cleanup occurred without the contractor. This timeline became central. In 2021, Brian had access to a real source of lead. While the contractor's statement did not explain how the lead was administered, it established where it came from and supported the theory of intentional exposure. As the investigation progressed, another key detail emerged. Hannah had multiple life insurance policies totaling about $3 million. All policies named Brian as policyholder and sole beneficiary. Because they were spread across several insurers, they were harder to detect and obscured the overall coverage. The first policy was taken out in 2020, and Hannah likely knew about it. In 2021, around the time her health declined, additional policies were added. Attempts to increase coverage by another one. $5 million were denied when applications were rejected. The timing of these expansions, coinciding with Hannah's worsening condition, strengthened the case for intent. The health questionnaires required for approval were especially important. They demanded proof of good health, and significant weight loss could trigger denial. According to Hannah, Brian pressured her to wear weighted ankle bands during weigh-ins to conceal her weight loss and make her appear stable, benefiting the applications. During medical consultations, Brian seemed more focused on policy limits and conditions than on diagnosis or treatment. Staff noted he repeatedly raised insurance technicalities as a priority. Hannah's insurance forms carried electronic signatures, which later became disputed. The defense claimed Hannah was aware and involved. She denied this, saying Brian had access to some of her digital accounts. Investigators focused less on the specific content of the forms and more on the broader questions: who initiated the applications, who stood to benefit, and how medical documentation was tailored to fit policy requirements. A review of the family's coverage revealed a red flag. Brian, the primary earner, had a relatively modest policy, while Hannah, who contributed less financially, was insured for far larger amounts. Typically, higher earners carry higher coverage. This discrepancy suggested potential financial misconduct and pointed to a clear motive. Hannah's death would have yielded substantial payouts to Brian. By trial, both sides had firm positions. The prosecution argued that Brian deliberately poisoned Hannah with lead to collect insurance benefits, supported by medical data, a detailed timeline, and extensive financial records. The defense tried to undermine the evidence, citing procedural issues. They emphasized that there was no direct proof of how the lead entered Hannah's system and urged the court to reject circumstantial evidence without definitive proof of the method of poisoning. Court proceedings began in June 2025 on an expedited schedule. The defense concentrated on the collection and storage of biological samples, noting that urine was sometimes collected in non-standard containers and handled outside proper laboratory conditions. They also emphasized two gaps: the incomplete chemical comparison between the lead found in Brian's clinic and the lead detected in Hannah's body, and the absence of the original supplement containers. The defense proposed alternative explanations, including accidental exposure. After hearing both sides, the court ruled the medical and procedural evidence admissible. It acknowledged procedural flaws that could affect how jurors weighed the evidence, but found they did not make it invalid. When witness testimony ended, the defense called no witnesses, arguing the prosecution bore the burden of proof. In closing, the prosecution presented a timeline. Brian obtained access to lead in 2021. Hannah's health declined soon after. No lead sources were found in the home. The theory of shared environmental exposure was weakened because no other household members showed contamination. The prosecution cited financial motive. Insurance policies and attempts to increase coverage, and medical analysis that refuted Brian's claim that he himself had been poisoned. The defense maintained that the evidence was circumstantial and lacked direct proof of how lead entered Hannah's system. After several hours of deliberation, the jury found Brian Mann guilty of attempted murder. The court ordered Brian held without bail, pending sentencing, and scheduled a trial for early August 2025. The judge outlined potential penalties, including life in prison, depending on the extent of harm to Hannah and the level of planning. At the August hearing, with Brian Mann already convicted of attempted murder using toxic substances, the prosecution sought the maximum sentence. They argued his actions were not a brief lapse, but a calculated, multi-stage effort over several months. During this period, he hid Hannah's worsening condition from medical providers, delayed her diagnosis, and promoted a false narrative of a shared household source. The defense asked the court to avoid a life sentence, citing Brian's clean record, community standing, medical career, prior support for his family, Hannah's survival and ongoing treatment, and lingering uncertainty about his intent. In explaining its decision, the court found that the full body of evidence, medical records, financial documents, witness testimony, and investigative findings showed a deliberate conduct. The judge described the crimes as prolonged, causing irreparable harm, with lifelong consequences for Hannah. Brian Mann was sentenced to 25 years in state prison, with no parole eligibility for the first 20 years. The court also ordered restitution for Hannah's medical costs and emotional damages, with the amount to be set in a separate civil proceeding. The sentence did not restore Hannah's former life. Although her condition stabilized, the effects of severe lead poisoning were irreversible. Doctors reported lasting neurological impairments, chronic pain, persistent fatigue, and a need for lifelong blood monitoring. Some motor function returned, but she still required a wheelchair for long distances. Hannah's son and daughter were placed in the care of her relatives. The case drew a strong public response. Former patients of Brian's clinic were shocked and confused by the verdict. Shortly after his arrest, the clinic was closed. Authorities seized all medical equipment, including the X-ray machine, for forensic analysis. Brian's medical license was revoked, and the building was later put up for sale. Insurance companies tied to the case launched internal audits of policies associated with Brian. They introduced new risk assessment measures, such as stricter verification of medical information for high-value policies. For law enforcement, the case set a precedent. Toxicological evidence can establish intent even without recovering the substance's delivery method. Investigators emphasized that indirect evidence, backed by expert analysis and consistent witness testimony, was pivotal in securing the conviction. Hannah publicly thanked the medical team, investigators, and witnesses, saying their efforts likely saved her life. She did not discuss future plans, focusing instead on healing and caring for her son and daughter. It was a warm summer night in July 1997, in a quiet neighborhood in Whittier, California, the kind of place where violence never happens. On a deserted street in the middle of the night, gunshots pierced the silence. When police arrived, they found a chaotic scene. Bruce Cleland, a respected software engineer, lying in a pool of blood. It quickly became clear that this was no random act of violence. It was something more planned, deliberate, and sinister. Bruce Cleland was born on March 31, 1954, in South Pasadena, California. He grew up in an affluent neighborhood with his older sister, surrounded by comfort and opportunity. Both of his parents were highly educated, financially secure, with strong signs of family wealth from earlier generations. From the outside, the Clelands looked like the perfect family: accomplished parents, well-raised children, and a bright future. Bruce was exceptionally intelligent from a young age. However, as a teenager, he discovered that his intelligence couldn't shield him from being treated cruelly. In 1968, he began attending South Pasadena High School, where his appearance and mannerisms made him a target for bullying. He was often teased and mockingly nicknamed Tiny Tim, after the entertainer known for his unusual voice and eccentric personality. For Bruce, the nickname cut deeper than just a jab at his slight build and soft-spoken voice. It symbolized how others saw him: gentle, awkward, and easy to dismiss. Yet instead of lashing out, Bruce endured the teasing with quiet resilience. He rarely showed anger and often coped by laughing at himself. His shy, reserved nature left him vulnerable. Throughout high school, he never dated, and his classmates thought he was weak. Still, he formed a small circle of close friends who appreciated his intelligence, kind personality. At home, his father, Harold Cleland, was his greatest supporter. The two shared a special bond, attending air shows and football games together, moments that gave Bruce a sense of belonging and strength. Romance intrigued him, but his lack of confidence kept him from pursuing relationships. Believing rejection was inevitable, he focused on academics instead. Science and technology became his refuge. Physics, mathematics, and computers fascinated him. His dedication paid off. By the time he graduated in June 1972, Bruce ranked among the top students in his class. He went on to attend Harvey Mudd College in Claremont, California, one of the country's most prestigious science and engineering schools. There, he experimented with social life, parties, beer, new friendships, but never let distractions interfere with his studies. In June 1976, he graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree and soon entered Stanford University, where he earned his master's degree in 1978. With his education complete, Bruce launched a successful career. He first worked at General Electric in San Jose, California, before later joining TRW as a software engineer. His projects were highly technical and sometimes involved classified contracts with the United States military. In 1987, Bruce transferred within the company and relocated to Redondo Beach. By then, he was earning over $100,000 a year, a remarkable salary at the time. Yet despite his income, Bruce lived simply. He drove modest cars, avoided luxury, and invested carefully in savings and stocks. For him, practicality always outweighed status, and by the late 1982, he had quietly built substantial personal wealth. Colleagues admired Bruce for his discipline and frugality. Every decision he made, whether financial or personal, reflected a thoughtful, methodical character. By the 1992, he was in his 40s, financially secure, and respected in his field. The shy teenager, once mocked in high school, had grown into a man with stability and confidence. Yet in matters of the heart, Bruce still seemed paralyzed. Years of solitude and inexperience left him uncertain and hesitant when it came to love. All of that changed in late 1995. That year, Bruce met a woman who would alter the course of his life, Rebecca. Their paths crossed at a local swap meet where Rebecca was selling spices. For Bruce, who had never been much of a dater, the encounter was electric. Captivated by her beauty and charm, he clumsily tried to impress her, even offering the idea of a job at an IT company. Rebecca handed him her resume. Soon afterward, Bruce called her. A relationship began. From the start, Rebecca's intentions appeared unusually direct. Within a week of meeting, she suggested marriage. For Bruce, who had never experienced such attention from a woman, the proposal was overwhelming yet deeply flattering. Eager for love, he agreed. Stepping blindly into his first serious relationship, Rebecca wasted no time. She introduced him to her 5-year-old son, claiming she had no contact with the boy's father and did not even know his identity. Almost immediately, she leaned on Bruce for financial support. Complaining about her living situation, she accepted his offer to rent her an apartment. Bruce furnished it, covered expenses, and even bought her a car. At first, it was a used Honda, but soon he upgraded it to a new Toyota after her persuasion. Over time, the requests grew bolder. Cosmetic surgery, jewelry, even a boat. For Bruce, who had spent years carefully saving, generosity felt like love. For Rebecca, it became a test of how much she could extract. Rebecca insisted on waiting until marriage for physical intimacy, something he interpreted as a sign of morality and self-respect. She claimed she had only ever been with one man, the father of her child. To Bruce, this made her unique, someone worth protecting and sacrificing for. When it came time to choose an engagement ring, Rebecca selected an extravagant diamond worth $10,000. Despite his normally cautious nature with money, Bruce eagerly paid. Soon after, she set her sights on a 4-bedroom house near Los Angeles, priced at $350,000, an enormous commitment for the mid-negative 1,990 seconds. Bruce purchased it, believing it was a gesture of love and security. They had a wedding in October 1996, but Rebecca wanted more. She envisioned a lavish church ceremony in January 1997, one she felt would showcase her true worth. Until then, she suggested that she and her son move into the new house, while Bruce wait until the church wedding before joining them. To Bruce, this seemed like a sign of tradition and respect. In reality, Rebecca had already discovered his greatest weakness, his innocence. She knew he was inexperienced with women, defenseless against manipulation, and utterly flattered by her attention. What Bruce saw as love, Rebecca quickly turned into leverage. But who was Rebecca, really? Her story had begun long before she ever met Bruce. Her mother, Lucy, grew up in Mexico, where she endured abuse that led to an early pregnancy. Pressured by her family to marry her abuser to avoid shame, Lucy entered a doomed marriage plagued by instability and poverty. Seeking escape, the family eventually immigrated to the United States, hoping for a better life. On August 15, 1969, Rebecca Salcedo was born in California, the third daughter in a family already marked by hardship. Her father abandoned the household when she was still a child, leaving her mother, Lucy, to shoulder the burden of raising 3 daughters alone. Years later, the family discovered that he had died, but by then, Lucy had long been forced into the dual role of provider and caregiver. Life in California was expensive, and though the extended family sometimes helped, money was always scarce. Eventually, Lucy remarried. Her new husband, Pedro Salcedo, accepted the girls as his own and tried to bring stability to the home. Still, Pedro was not wealthy, and the family's lifestyle remained modest, with every dollar carefully stretched just to cover essentials. Even with Pedro's support, Lucy's mental health began to unravel. Withdrawn and overwhelmed, she increasingly retreated from daily responsibilities. This left her daughters with little structure or guidance. Instead of a cohesive, supportive household, tension became the norm. The sisters quarreled constantly, competing against one another rather than working together. In this chaotic atmosphere, Rebecca quickly realized she could live without real authority over her. She came and went as she pleased, shaping her own rules. As Rebecca entered her teenage years, she embraced a lifestyle centered on attention, popularity, and freedom. Schoolwork became secondary. She preferred parties, shopping trips, and the thrill of being noticed. With natural charm and striking looks, she quickly learned that she could bend situations to her advantage. Boys offered her rides, gifts, and money, benefits she rarely turned down. By age 16, she took her independence to another level. She agreed to marry a man who desperately needed a green card. As a U.S. citizen, she could provide it, and in return, she received $2 This marriage of convenience marked a turning point. It was the first in a long series of calculated decisions where relationships became a means of survival, opportunity, and profit. The early 1992s introduced even greater turmoil. In 1991, Rebecca was arrested on charges of possession of illegal substances with intent to sell. The conviction resulted in a 3-year prison sentence. Around the same time, she discovered she was pregnant. When asked about the father, she admitted she had no idea who he was. On October 22, 1991, while still behind bars, she gave birth to a son. Her family cared for the child during her incarceration. Though sentenced to 3 years, she was released after roughly a year and a half for good behavior. This dark chapter would later be completely hidden from Bruce Cleland, who never suspected the reality of her past. Upon leaving prison, Rebecca faced the daunting challenge of rebuilding her life. No job, no degree, and the responsibility of a young child, but she soon entered a relationship that offered emotional refuge. Her partner was Sherry, a former police officer. To those who knew Rebecca at the time, Sherry seemed to be her true love. Rebecca even had Sherry's name tattooed on her leg as a permanent sign of commitment. For several years, from 1991 to 1994, Rebecca, Sherry, and her son built a life together. It was perhaps the most stable and genuinely happy period Rebecca ever experienced. That sense of stability was abruptly shattered in 1994. Lucy, long plagued by mental illness, took her own life. The tragedy devastated Rebecca. Friends and family noticed a dramatic change in her behavior. Once relatively steady, she became volatile, argumentative, and unpredictable. Her relationship with Sherry began to crumble under constant fights, infidelity, and Rebecca's return to partying. By the end of the year, the bond was broken. Rebecca once again found herself untethered, drifting from one social circle to another, seeking someone new to provide the security and attention she craved. It was in this vulnerable and unstable period that Rebecca crossed paths with Bruce Cleland. To her, Bruce represented something she had been seeking for years, a man who was gentle, trusting, and financially secure. She immediately recognized his naivety in matters of love and knew how to craft a persona that would appeal to him. She presented herself as principled, loyal, and morally upright. To Rebecca, Bruce was the perfect target, wealthy, inexperienced, and eager to please. Bruce, captivated by love, completely trusted Rebecca. He bought a house, looking forward to them living together. But the house quickly became a busy center of activity. Rebecca invited friends over frequently, hosted parties, and entertained men whom she introduced as cousins. Bruce never questioned her explanations. His deep trust, combined with his lack of relationship experience, left him unable to see what was happening right in front of him. In January 1997, their lavish church wedding finally took place, a ceremony designed to match Rebecca's ambitions and to project an image of perfection. To the outside world, they seemed like a success story. Bruce, the accomplished, intelligent professional, and Rebecca, the devoted young wife, But appearances were deceiving. At her bachelorette party, just days before the ceremony, Rebecca confided to friends that she didn't love Bruce at all. Her marriage, she admitted, was about one thing only: money. Bruce and Rebecca traveled to Hawaii for their honeymoon, but the trip only highlighted how fragile their union truly was. Even then, Rebecca could not hide her disdain. She called friends and ridiculed her new husband, describing her intimate life with him in cruel detail, saying it was the most humiliating experience of her life. Many hoped marriage might soften Rebecca, that with time she would grow into the role of a loyal partner, especially with a man as devoted as Bruce. He continued to shower her with kindness, patience, and loyalty, but Rebecca never even pretended to reciprocate. Once back from Hawaii, the thin facade of marriage crumbled entirely. Rebecca returned to late nights, wild parties, and lavish spending, burning through Bruce's money as though it were endless. Her infidelity was no secret. She saw other men openly, and while friends noticed, Bruce seemed unwilling, or unable, to confront the truth. Instead, he retreated into his work, spending less time at home and leaving Rebecca free to indulge in her desires. Within just 4 months of their wedding, the situation was irreparably broken. Rebecca began talking openly about divorce, boasting to her friends about the large settlement she expected to secure. What she failed to understand, however, was California's clear legal boundary. The fortune Bruce had carefully built before their marriage would remain his. Still, Rebecca pressed forward, determined to turn the marriage into profit. The first public cracks appeared in April when police were called to their home after a heated, loud argument spilled out of control. For Bruce, the tension and stress became unbearable. Naturally calm and soft-spoken, he was not a man prone to anger, but being forced out of his own home was a breaking point. He left the house and sought legal advice, slowly beginning to recognize what he had long denied. Rebecca's affections were never real. She was motivated purely by money. The division of assets after their split was not what she expected. Rebecca's dreams went up in smoke. Because Bruce had purchased his home and accumulated wealth before marriage, those assets were legally protected. The only amount subject to division totaled around $5,000, a devastating blow to her expectations. To Rebecca, it felt like an insult, yet she wasn't ready to let go. Even after their separation, she continued using Bruce's credit cards without permission. Designer clothing, glittering jewelry, nights at upscale restaurants, beauty treatments, and party expenses all found their way onto his statements. From the outside, Rebecca maintained the image of glamour and abundance. In reality, it was Bruce's steady paycheck that still fueled her lifestyle. Meanwhile, Bruce moved back into his parents' home. His attorney advised him to sever ties completely, to cut Rebecca off for good. But Bruce, hopeful to a fault, clung to the possibility that their marriage might be salvaged. Rebecca, ever calculating, sensed his weakness and dangled the idea of reconciliation. On the morning of Friday, July 25, 1997, she called him with a suggestion. Perhaps they could start over. To Bruce, it was the one thing he had longed to hear. That evening, they arranged to meet at the same restaurant where they had first gone on a date. Bruce picked her up, and by 9:30 p.m., they were seated together, sharing dinner. An hour later, they were back on the road. At Rebecca's urging, they stopped by her uncle's house, a man she often described as a father figure. The visit seemed ordinary, calm even. Around 1 o'clock a.m., they said their goodbyes and drove off. Rebecca was behind the wheel when their car pulled onto a quiet, isolated stretch of road. She suddenly claimed she needed to step out and check the tailgate. Bruce, sitting in the passenger seat, waited. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. The stillness of the night shattered as gunshots rang out. Bruce was struck and scrambled out of the car, attempting to flee, but another shot tore into his back. He collapsed to the ground, helpless, as the killer closed in and delivered a final shot to his head. From the window of a nearby house, a woman named Virginia Selva caught a glimpse of the horror unfolding outside. Horrified, she immediately dialed 911. When police arrived, they found Bruce lying lifeless only feet from his car. Rebecca was seated near the hood, claiming she had been struck in the head and knocked unconscious, but detectives noticed something strange from the very start. Rebecca showed no panic, no tears, no shock. Instead, she calmly offered an explanation. It must have been a robbery. She even insisted that her diamond wedding ring had been stolen, yet investigators quickly noticed the inconsistencies. Her purse and cell phone remained untouched inside the car. Bruce's wallet, with cash inside, was still in his pocket. A medical examination showed she had no head injuries. When Rebecca sat down with investigators, her statements immediately struck detectives as odd. Rather than focusing on her husband's violent death, she spoke at length about her outfit that evening, their first date years earlier, and the restaurant they had just visited. None of it addressed the brutality of what had happened on that road. Detectives grew increasingly skeptical. A closer look at her background and at the short marriage itself quickly revealed troubling signs. Friends and acquaintances described a woman obsessed with material wealth, prone to extravagant spending, unfaithful to her husband, and openly dissatisfied with the marriage from the very beginning. Then came the discovery that shattered any lingering doubts. Just 1 month before Bruce's murder, Rebecca had quietly taken out multiple life insurance policies in his name, totaling roughly $1 million. On the documents, Bruce's signature had been crudely forged. If he were to die, Rebecca stood to inherit everything: his house, his possessions, and the insurance payout. Investigators also learned that Bruce was a man without enemies. No grudges, no disputes, no history of violence, but witnesses near the crime scene recalled something else. They had seen a young Latino male in the area that night. Detectives turned to Rebecca's phone records. One name stood out immediately: Alvaro Quesada, her cousin. He matched the witness description. The evidence trail closed in quickly. Under interrogation, Alvaro confessed to being the gunman. He admitted he had ambushed Bruce at Rebecca's request. His brother, José Quesada, also confessed to participating in the crime. Both men independently pointed to Rebecca as the orchestrator, the mastermind who had manipulated them into carrying out the killing. The case proceeded to trial. In June 2000, Rebecca Cleland, along with Alvaro Quesada and José Quesada, were convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The jury determined the crime involved special circumstances, financial gain, and lying in wait. Rebecca showed no remorse throughout the proceedings. In 2003, she received her sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Today, she remains incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Corona. Alvaro and Jose are also serving life sentences in California state prisons. For Bruce's parent, the verdict provided accountability but little comfort. From the start, they had sensed something was wrong. They had pleaded with their son not to marry Rebecca, worried she cared only for his money. In the months following the wedding, they watched helplessly as his once bright spirit dimmed. Bruce eventually confided that he planned to file for divorce, but by then, Rebecca's plan was already in motion. Bruce Cleland's life had always been defined by quiet, determination, and deep kindness. First in his studies, then in his career, and above all, in the love he showed to family and friends. His murder at the hands of the woman he trusted most left everyone who knew him devastated. As his father later remarked with sorrowful certainty, "She planned it from the beginning." The story of Bruce Cleland remains a haunting reminder of how trust can be betrayed, how greed can corrupt love into something deadly, and how one man's simple, dignified life was stolen by someone who saw him only as a means to an end.